Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Clockmaker's Legacy, from the Reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D., by Arthur Conan Doyle, in style. Chapter 1. The Hour That Would Not Pass. It was a damp and bitterly gray morning in late November when I was roused from my reading by the abrupt clatter of boots upon the stairs. A moment later, Sherlock Holmes strode into our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, his sharp eyes gleaming beneath the brim of a wet deerstalker, and his coat dripping faintly onto the floor. Without preamble, he tossed a telegram onto my lap and began removing his gloves with methodical intensity. "You might care to glance at that, Watson," he said. "An old acquaintance of mine, Mr. Tobias Wetherell of Clerkenwell, has been found dead in his workshop. Locked room, no sign of foul play. Scotland Yard is already inclined to attribute it to natural causes." "Yet your tone suggests you do not share that opinion," I remarked, scanning the telegram. "Clockmaker found dead, door locked from inside, wristwatch stopped at 3:47 precisely, no sign of disturbance, body seated at workbench. Curious." "Curious?" Holmes repeated, tugging off his overcoat. "It's infuriatingly tidy, Watson. A man of Wetherell's discipline does not simply expire at his bench like a candle guttering in the wind, and I find the stopped time to be poetic, too poetic." "You knew him well?" "Well enough," Holmes replied, settling into his chair and lighting a cigarette. "Wetherell was no mere tinker. He was a horological artisan. He restored timepieces of exquisite delicacy and, more importantly, built mechanical locks for clients who prized security above all else. When a man like that dies behind one of his own devices, I pay attention." I leaned forward, intrigued. "Then we are to investigate?" "I have already wired Inspector Lestrade that we shall meet him at the workshop," Holmes said, exhaling a spiral of smoke. "Get your coat, Watson. Time waits for no man, except, apparently, Tobias Wetherell." Clerkenwell was draped in its usual veil of soot and industrious gloom, the air smelling of brass filings, damp coal smoke, and the sour tang of river fog. We turned onto a narrow alley, Bleecker Street, where a hanging iron sign read, "Wetherell and Sons, horologists since 1832. Lestrade stood in the doorway, bundled in a dark greatcoat, his face a picture of impatience. "Holmes," he said with a nod. "Doctor." "Lestrade," Holmes greeted briskly. "Any developments?" "None that would change the coroner's opinion," the inspector grunted. "Wetherell's housekeeper found the workshop locked from the inside just after breakfast. She knocked, got no reply, and summoned the constables. They forced the door. He was dead. Heart attack, most likely. 58. That's not uncommon. Now is it?" Holmes said nothing. He stepped through the threshold with the manner of a man entering a sacred space. The workshop was dim, save for the gray light that seeped through a frosted upper window. Rows of clocks lined the walls, their ticking staggered and slightly off-sync, creating a subtle dissonance. Tobias Wetherell himself was still slumped over the long oak bench, chin to chest, spectacles still perched on his nose. His right hand rested beside of tiny screwdrivers. In the crook of his left wrist, his watch had stopped at precisely 3:47. Watson moved to examine the body while Holmes bent low to inspect the surface of the workbench. "No signs of struggle," I murmured. "Rigor mortis has begun. He likely died in the early morning hours, that, as the timepiece suggests. Pulse would have ceased long before he was discovered." "And yet," Holmes said, "he was working." I looked up. "What do you mean?" Holmes tapped the opened panel of a small brass clock on the bench. This mechanism was mid-repair. Note the missing escapement wheel. It's been removed, possibly inspected. Wetherell was not relaxing before his death. He was engaged in delicate work. Lestrade sighed. "Is that unusual, Holmes? Perhaps the man was obsessed with his craft and took no heed of his own failing health." "Perhaps," Holmes said. He examined the deceased's hand more closely. "But notice this. Watson?" I stepped forward and peered at the clockmaker's fingertips. They were ink-stained, not uncommon, but beneath the stains were faint abrasions. Scratches, even bruising. Holmes's brow furrowed. "He was trying to grip something," Holmes muttered. "Or someone was trying to pry something from him." "You mean foul play?" Lestrade said, incredulous. "There's not a mark on him." Holmes ignored him. He moved with purpose toward the far cabinet, where rows of labeled drawers were neatly arranged. One was half open, barely a finger's width. Inside, gears and watch springs gleamed faintly. Holmes's fingers danced over the compartments. He opened a drawer marked Private, W. At its bottom lay a small, crumpled page, creases deep, as though it had been stuffed there in haste. He unfolded it and read silently. Then his expression shifted, first to interest, then to a rare flicker of unease. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes handed me the paper. On it, in a faint, spidery hand, were the words, "They have found me at last. I fear the hours I have borrowed are soon to be repaid. If you read this, my secret lies where the pendulum swings and the old name sleeps. Beware the twin hands of time. They strike not once, but twice." Beneath the message, the letter ended abruptly, mid-word. "Twin hands of time," I repeated aloud. What could it mean? Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he leaned in close to the body again, this time lifting the man's left wrist with a handkerchief. He studied the timepiece. "A Wetherell original," he murmured. "Note the engraving, to T.W., for every second well spent, J.W. "J.W.?" I asked. "His brother," Holmes replied. "Jonathan Wetherell. A genius in his own right. They founded the company together. But Jonathan vanished 10 years ago under mysterious circumstances. There were whispers of embezzlement, even madness. He was never found." I raised an eyebrow. "You believe he may have returned?" "I believe the game has begun," Holmes said quietly. The fog was thick upon the windows as Holmes and I sat before the fire, the mysterious letter laid out on the table beside a set of diagrams Holmes had drawn from memory, layouts of the Wetherell workshop, the clock in question, and a curious map of London with circles drawn around certain old churches. "I've been thinking," Holmes said suddenly, rising to pace, "about the phrase, 'where the pendulum swings and the old name sleeps.' It's poetic, yes, but also literal. A pendulum swings in a long case clock, and a name may sleep, perhaps a name engraved or a gravestone." "You think this relates to a burial?" I asked. "Or a hidden message," Holmes said. "Jonathan Wetherell may not have disappeared willingly. He may have been hiding. Perhaps Tobias knew this, and the secret is hidden in one of his creations, one that has not been tampered with." At that moment, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a nervous young woman in a dark veil. "Mr. Holmes?" she said. "My name is Clara Wetherell. Tobias was my uncle. There's something I must tell you. Something I should have told the police. But I was afraid." Holmes gave her a penetrating look, then gestured to the chair beside him. "You've come to the right place, Miss Wetherell." "What?" he said. "Begin at the beginning and omit nothing." Chapter 2, The Heir's Confession. The flickering lamplight cast soft shadows on the walls of our sitting room as Clara Wetherell seated herself, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the folds of her cloak. There was something unsettling about her demeanor. Her eyes darted nervously between Holmes and myself, her lips pressed together as though she were weighing the worth of each word before speaking it aloud. "Please, Miss Wetherell," Holmes urged, his voice as calm as the steady ticking of the many clocks that filled the room. "You have come to us for a reason. If you have information that can help solve your uncle's death, you must be entirely candid." She nodded, then took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "I've been afraid," she began, her voice soft, almost hesitant, afraid of what I might uncover and what others might learn. I wasn't sure I should come at all, but then the telegram came, and I knew. My uncle's death was no accident." Holmes leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing. "You believe your uncle's death was murder?" She hesitated. "I don't know for certain, but I fear it may be connected to something. Something that has haunted our family for years. You see, my uncle was not the only Wetherell to work with timepieces. His brother, my father's brother, Jonathan Wetherell, disappeared a decade ago under mysterious circumstances. But there were rumors." She trailed off, her hands clutching the edge of her chair. "Rumors, Miss Wetherell?" Holmes prompted gently. Clara nodded again. "Jonathan was a brilliant man, a genius, really. They built the company together, but Jonathan was always obsessed with something beyond the mechanics of clocks. He believed time wasn't just something we measured, it was something we could control. He became consumed with the idea that time itself could be manipulated." She paused and gave a nervous laugh, as though the idea now sounded absurd. "He started to believe that if you could synchronize certain mechanisms precisely, you could unlock hidden forces that could change the course of events, even." "Change the course of events?" Holmes repeated, his voice becoming sharper. Clara nodded slowly. He thought that by manipulating the passage of time, he could make things happen. He spoke of something called the hourglass formula, a set of mathematical equations combined with precise clockwork mechanisms. He kept it all secret, of course. But when he vanished, I found one of his journals. It was filled with pages of strange notations, symbols, numbers, drawings of clock mechanisms I couldn't begin to understand. And then there was the last page, the one where he wrote that he had succeeded, that he had found the key. Holmes's eyes gleamed with a renewed intensity. The key? The key to controlling time itself, Clara whispered. He said he had built a clock that could do it, unlock a power that could bend the very fabric of time to his will. But after he vanished, my Uncle Tobias never spoke of it again, and I never told anyone about that journal. I thought it was all just madness, but now with Uncle Tobias dead, I'm not so sure anymore. I'm afraid that someone might have come to finish what Jonathan started. Holmes sat back, his fingers steepled under his chin as he mulled over Clara's words. So you believe that Jonathan's disappearance and your uncle's death may be connected to this hourglass formula? Clara nodded. Yes, Mr. Holmes. I believe that someone is searching for the formula my uncle hid, and they might have been willing to do anything to find it, even kill. I watched Holmes closely, noting the way his sharp mind turned over the clues with methodical precision. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. You said that your Uncle Tobias kept a certain secrecy after your father's brother's disappearance. Was there any evidence of Jonathan's presence in the workshop recently? Any clue that might indicate he had returned? Clara shifted in her seat, her fingers twisting together. I don't know, but there was something unusual. A few months ago, I found a set of tools missing from the workshop, precise tools used only for the finest of clockwork repairs. Uncle Tobias said he had lent them to someone in the neighborhood, but he wouldn't say who. I didn't press him about it at the time, but now I wonder. Holmes stood suddenly, causing Clara to startle. Your uncle, it seems, had more to hide than we realized. Watson, I think it is time we had a look at his personal effects. If Jonathan Wetherell did leave behind any trace of his activities, it is most certainly in his brother's possession. I rose as well, eager to assist. You suspect the formula, then? That this mysterious key Jonathan mentioned might be hidden in one of the timepieces? I do, Holmes replied, his voice ringing with quiet confidence. And if there is a clue in the workshop, it may not be immediately obvious. The mind of a man like Tobias Wetherell would not have been so easily fooled by a simple timepiece. He would have known how to hide his secrets. We arrived at the workshop as twilight fell, casting the windows in a pale, silvery light. Lestrade had given us permission to investigate further, though his skepticism was evident in his furrowed brow as he handed us the keys to the locked study. Holmes wasted no time in advancing into the cluttered workshop, his keen eyes scanning the room with unmatched precision. As he examined the various drawers and cabinets filled with the detritus of clockmaking, gears, springs, and tiny precision tools, I stood quietly at his side, awaiting any developments. Holmes stopped in front of a large walnut armoire, his hand lingering on the handle. Here, Watson, he said quietly. This is where the key will likely be found. He opened the armoire, revealing a series of meticulously organized shelves stacked with timepieces, each one in various stages of repair. He rifled through them quickly, his eyes flashing as he inspected each in turn. There is something, Holmes muttered, pulling a small, delicate watch from a shelf at the far end. It was unlike any I had ever seen. The case was made of an unmarked dark metal, its intricate etchings forming an intricate pattern of interlocking spirals. The hands were poised at exactly 3:47. Watson, look at this, Holmes said, handing me the timepiece. Notice anything unusual? I studied it carefully, then looked up at him. The hands, they're set to the same time as the one Tobias Wetherell wore when he died. And these markings, they appear to be more than just decorative. Holmes smiled. Precisely. This watch is not just a timepiece, Watson. It's a map to the secret that Jonathan Wetherell believed he had discovered. He paused, then turned to Clara. Miss Wetherell, do you have any knowledge of a hidden compartment or passage in this workshop? Clara looked confused. A hidden passage? No, nothing like that. My uncle was a methodical man. Everything was in plain view. Holmes nodded, still holding the watch in his hand. It's clear that your uncle was hiding something, Miss Wetherell. Something tied to this device. But where? Perhaps the answer lies within the mechanism itself. With that, he began to twist the small case open, working with the precision of a master craftsman. The faint click of the mechanism echoed in the silence, and I saw the gleam of something hidden within the watch's inner workings. "Ah," Holmes murmured. "Here it is." A tiny compartment opened within the watch, revealing a small, folded piece of parchment. He handed it to Clara, who took it with trembling fingers. She unrolled the paper slowly. On it were only 2 words: the pendulum. Holmes's expression hardened, his gaze fixed firmly on Clara. It seems we have a new lead. This pendulum could be the key to unlocking Jonathan Wetherell's final secret, and perhaps to understanding your uncle's death. Clara stared at the note, her face pale. What does it mean? Where does it lead? Holmes's eyes gleamed with excitement. That, Miss Wetherell, is precisely what we are about to find out. And so the game was afoot. The mystery of Tobias Wetherell's death and Jonathan's vanished legacy had only just begun to unfold. Chapter 3. The Pendulum's Secrets. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant rumble of a storm rolling in from the Thames as Holmes, Clara, and I stood outside the Wetherell workshop. Clara, still clutching the tiny piece of parchment that had been hidden in the clockwork of her uncle's timepiece, was clearly shaken. She had always known her family had its secrets, but the revelation of her uncle's hidden involvement in his brother Jonathan's mysterious research had thrust her into a world she could scarcely comprehend. Holmes, however, seemed energized by the discovery. His usually calm demeanor had taken on an intensity that made it clear he was eager to continue his investigation. He looked down at the note in his hands, the words, "the pendulum," echoing in his mind like a riddle only he could solve. "We must go to the library, Watson," Holmes said abruptly, his voice now carrying that familiar edge of urgency. If we are to uncover the meaning of this cryptic message, we must first delve into the history of time, and of course, the Wetherell family. I have a suspicion that the pendulum is not merely a reference to a clock. No, it could be far more significant than that. Clara turned to us, her face pale but resolute. What does this all mean, Mr. Holmes? What is the pendulum? And how is it connected to my uncle's death? And my father's brother, Jonathan? Holmes looked up at Clara, his gaze softened for a moment. Miss Wetherell, I believe the pendulum refers to an invention, a mechanism that can manipulate time itself. This notion was your uncle's obsession, I suspect. Jonathan Wetherell had spent years constructing a device that could alter time, either by slowing it down or accelerating it. He believed such power could change history itself, but I do not believe he was the only one interested in his theories. Someone else, perhaps, has been attempting to finish his work. I don't understand, Clara murmured, shaking her head. How could such a thing be possible? Are you saying my uncle was murdered because of a clock? A very specific clock, Miss Wetherell, Holmes replied, but not just any clock. This clock, this pendulum, is unlike anything anyone has seen before. If it exists, it could be dangerous in the wrong hands, and it seems someone is willing to kill to keep it hidden. I glanced at Clara, noting the deep furrow between her brows. She was clearly not yet grasping the full weight of Holmes's words, but I could see her fear beginning to shift toward something akin to determination. She wanted answers, as much as Holmes did, though her family legacy was far more personal than any mystery I had encountered before. We need to move quickly, Holmes added, before this pendulum becomes a deadly weapon in the hands of those who do not understand it. Our first destination was the Wetherell Family Library, a dark, musty room lined with old bookshelves filled with tomes on various subjects. It had been years since Clara had last visited it, and she had told us earlier that she did not know where her uncle kept most of his personal papers. However, she was certain that there would be a journal or some record of Jonathan Wetherell's work hidden among the various volumes. Her uncle had always been one for secrecy, but he had also respected the importance of knowledge, that even if only for himself. The moment we stepped inside, the air grew heavier, as though the room itself held its breath. The smell of aged paper and ink filled the air, mingling with the faintest trace of lavender from the potpourri in a corner. Holmes's eyes gleamed with an almost feverish energy as he began scanning the shelves, each book seeming to hold a clue that might unlock the mystery of the pendulum. "Watson? Miss Wetherell, I suggest you begin searching the lower shelves while I examine the collection of journals," Holmes instructed, his voice clipped with the concentration that only came when he was in the midst of a challenge. Clara and I nodded, and we both began sifting through the various volumes. As the minutes passed, I could feel the tension in the room rise. It was clear that time was against us. If Holmes's hunch was correct, there were people out there, possibly even in this very city, who would stop at nothing to find the pendulum, and those people might already be closing in on us. Clara knelt down to pull an old leather-bound book from a lower shelf. It was thick and heavy, its spine cracked from years of use. She opened it carefully, her fingers brushing over the pages as she scanned the table of contents. But the moment her eyes fell on one entry, she froze. "What is it, Clara?" I asked, moving closer to her side. "This," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is Jonathan's handwriting." Holmes, who had been engrossed in a collection of older volumes, immediately turned to us. "What did you find?" Clara pointed to a page near the back of the book. The handwriting was indeed Jonathan's, neat, precise, though the ink had faded with age. The page was titled. Holmes moved quickly to her side, his long fingers skimming over the words. He read aloud, "In my studies of the great timepieces of the world, I have uncovered something far greater than the mere mechanics of gears and springs. I have discovered the secret to manipulating time itself, a pendulum, a device of unparalleled precision, capable of accelerating or decelerating the passage of time with a level of control never before seen. But such a device must be built using the most intricate clockwork, and its creation requires resources that are beyond even my Uncle Tobias's means. I must finish it myself, but I fear I am not the only one who seeks such power. There are those who would stop at nothing to possess it." Clara gasped. "Jonathan really believed he could do it? Manipulate time?" Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes still glued to the page. "It seems he did, and he was not the only one interested in such a theory. But it is clear now, Miss Wetherell, that your Uncle Tobias was in some way involved in these experiments. Perhaps he continued Jonathan's work after his disappearance, or perhaps he was trying to stop it." I stepped back, my thoughts whirling. But what of the murder? Was Tobias killed because he knew too much? Or because someone thought he might be trying to destroy the pendulum? Holmes did not answer immediately, his mind clearly working through the details. "I suspect it may be a bit of both, Watson. There is still much we do not know. But one thing is certain. The pendulum is not a mere device of clocks. It is something far greater and far more dangerous." Clara was still holding the journal, her fingers trembling over the words. But if Jonathan finished his work and Uncle Tobias was involved, then what happened to the pendulum? Where is it now? Holmes's gaze sharpened, his lips curling into a small, enigmatic smile. "That, Miss Wetherell, is precisely what we will discover next. But we must proceed carefully. There are those who would stop at nothing to ensure the pendulum remains hidden, or worse, falls into the wrong hands." Holmes's theory had become even clearer as we left the library and as we made our way to the West End of London. The pendulum had to be hidden somewhere, perhaps in one of the many clockmakers' workshops scattered throughout the district. We knew that Jonathan had worked in secrecy, so it was likely that the pendulum itself would be stored in a place no one could easily find. The air was thick with the hustle and bustle of the city as we made our way through narrow alleyways and bustling streets, and I could feel the tension in Holmes's movements. He was on the hunt now, the sharpness of his intellect pushing him forward as he considered every possibility. "We're close, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low and steady. "The pendulum is not a myth. It is real, and it is here, somewhere in this district. We will find it, no matter what it takes." Clara, who had been quietly following us, looked uncertain, her face pale beneath the streetlights. "But what if someone else finds it first? What if they use it against us?" Holmes turned to her, his eyes glinting with that familiar mix of brilliance and cold calculation. "If they find it first, Miss Wetherell, we shall ensure it will never be used." With that, We pressed on, deeper into the labyrinthine streets of the West End, where the echoes of time seemed to hum softly in the background. The pendulum's secrets were waiting to be uncovered, and Holmes was determined to uncover them, no matter where they might lead. Chapter 4. The Ticking Clock of the West End. The night was drawing to a close, but Holmes's energy remained unflagging. His quick pace through the winding streets of the West End betrayed his excitement. The city around us seemed to pulse with the rhythm of its own clockwork, its movement a constant hum, much like the ticking of an old timepiece. But for Holmes, every tick was a clue, and every moment of silence between them was pregnant with meaning. As we reached the heart of the West End, I noticed a distinct change in the atmosphere. The streets grew narrower, the gas lamps more spaced apart, casting shadows that seemed to grow larger as the darkness deepened. The shops along the streets became less inviting, their displays of clocks, watches, and other trinkets seemingly mocking us with their polished surfaces. Holmes stopped in front of an old, weathered building, a clockmaker's shop, its windows smudged and its door partially ajar. The sign above read, "Dovetail Timepieces," and the faint sound of ticking, magnified by the quiet of the street, reached our ears. The presence of this shop in the West End was no coincidence. Jonathan Wetherell's work, it seemed, had taken him here, or someone connected to him had made sure to bring us to this very place. Holmes turned to Clara, his expression serious. "Miss Wetherell, this is where your uncle's search may have led him. The pendulum is likely hidden somewhere within this shop, though we must remain discreet. The owners, if they are part of this conspiracy, will not hesitate to act against us." Clara looked unsure, but there was resolve in her eyes now. "I'll do what I can to help, Mr. Holmes. I don't understand how all of this fits together. A clock that can manipulate time? It sounds like something out of a madman's fantasy." "It would be if it weren't for the facts, Miss Wetherell," Holmes replied, his voice low. "The science is there, hidden in plain sight. The clockwork, the mechanisms, they all form a delicate web. We are simply following the thread." We entered the shop cautiously. The dim light from the gas lamps inside gave the room a soft amber glow. The walls were lined with clocks of all shapes and sizes, from ornate grandfather clocks to delicate pocket watches. The ticking seemed louder in the confined space, a steady beat that could easily be mistaken for the rhythm of time itself. The owner of the shop, an elderly man with a hunched back and thick spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked up from his workbench. His hands, weathered and stained with oil, paused in their delicate task of adjusting a watch's inner workings. "Ah, visitors at this hour," he said in a gravelly voice. "Not a usual time for customers, but no matter. How can I assist you, good people?" Holmes, never one to waste words, stepped forward. "We are looking for information about a specific piece of clockwork, something of a unique nature, a device, perhaps, that could alter the flow of time itself." The old man blinked, his spectacles magnifying his eyes to comical proportions. For a moment I thought he might laugh at Holmes's words, as one would a fanciful tale, but instead he simply cleared his throat and muttered, "I've no use for such stories. Time, in my experience, flows steadily as it always has." Holmes gave a thin smile, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "That may be true for most, but I suspect your shop holds more than just conventional timepieces, my good sir." The man stiffened, his hands trembling slightly as he returned to his workbench, carefully setting down the pocket watch he had been adjusting. "I don't know what you mean, sir. I repair clocks, nothing more." Holmes's eyes flicked toward Clara, then back to the elderly clockmaker. "The pendulum," he said softly, but with unmistakable authority. "You know of it, and I believe you've seen it, perhaps even repaired it." The old man's face turned ashen. His hands paused mid-motion, and for a brief moment I saw genuine fear flicker across his face. But then it was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. He straightened up, his voice shaking as he spoke. "You're mistaken, sir. I've never heard of such a thing. I am but a humble clockmaker, and I keep to my work." Holmes studied the man intently, his eyes never wavering. "I think you are more than that, my good fellow. The pendulum is not something to be dismissed so lightly. It is a mechanism of great power, more than a mere tool. You may not wish to acknowledge its existence, but that does not change the fact that it is here, in your shop, perhaps even hidden in plain sight." The clockmaker took a deep breath, as though preparing himself for something inevitable. Then, to my surprise, he spoke again, this time in a low voice that trembled with both fear and something else, regret, perhaps. "You don't understand, Mr. Holmes. It's not just a clock. It's a mechanism that can—" Before he could finish, there was a sharp knock at the door, followed by the sound of footsteps. Holmes's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Stay back, Clara," he whispered. The clockmaker quickly went silent, his gaze darting toward the door, then back to Holmes. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Mr. Holmes," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "If you're looking for the pendulum, you'd best leave now. There are others who are willing to do far worse than simply threaten you." Holmes motioned for Clara to remain still as he stepped forward, his mind racing with deductions. "Who are these others you speak of?" The clockmaker looked torn, but finally, after a long pause, he replied, "I can't say. But if you value your life, Mr. Holmes, you'll stop your search. The pendulum is not something meant for human hands. It was never meant to be found." Just then, the door opened, and a figure emerged from the shadows. A man in a long, dark coat with a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. He stepped forward into the dim light, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The man was taller than most, and his posture was rigid, almost mechanical in nature. He raised his head slowly, and his eyes locked with mine, sending a jolt of recognition through me. I had seen him before, though I could not recall where. Holmes's gaze sharpened as he stepped back, his voice steady but filled with a sharp edge. "Who are you?" The man's lips curled into a cold smile. "My name is of no consequence, Mr. Holmes. What matters is that you are in over your head. I suggest you leave before it's too late." Holmes's face remained impassive, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. He had already sized up this new figure, and I knew he would not back down from a challenge. But there was something about the man's presence, something unsettling that suggested this was no mere thug. This was someone who had been watching us for some time. Holmes took a slow step forward, his voice low but clear. "I believe, sir, that we have only just begun to scratch the surface of this mystery. And as for your warning, it's far too late for that." Chapter 5. The Mask Unveiled. The tension in the room hung thick as the man in the dark coat stepped further into the light. His face remained half-shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, but I could see his eyes now. Cold, calculating, with a touch of something that suggested he was not easily moved by threats or warnings. Holmes, unfazed by the stranger's imposing presence, took another step forward, his posture unyielding. "I don't take kindly to threats, especially those without any merit," Holmes said, his voice steady and firm. "If you have something to say, then say it. Otherwise, I suggest you leave." The stranger chuckled softly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the shop like a distant bell tolling. "You misunderstand, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice smooth but laden with an almost palpable menace. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to offer you a simple choice: walk away or face the consequences." I could see the clockmaker flinch at these words, his face pale as though he knew exactly who this man was and what he was capable of. Holmes's eyes, however, remained fixed on the man, his expression unreadable. "You overestimate your influence, sir," Holmes replied coolly, his sharp gaze never leaving the stranger. "I don't make decisions based on intimidation. If you wish to prove your point, you'll have to do better than empty threats." For a moment, the stranger's eyes narrowed as if sizing up Holmes, considering whether this man truly understood the danger he was in. Then, with a slight gesture, the man motioned to the clockmaker, who had now retreated slightly, his back pressed against the workbench as though seeking escape. "You see, Mr. Holmes," the stranger began, his tone growing more measured, "this is not a game. This is a matter of life and death. The pendulum is not some harmless relic to be poked and prodded. It is far more dangerous than you can imagine. Its power." He trailed off, as if the weight of the words he had just spoken was too great to continue. He cleared his throat before finishing. "Its power can unravel everything, and I would rather not have to explain this further with the authorities involved." Holmes's eyes flicked toward the clockmaker, then back to the stranger. I knew that Holmes was weighing his options, trying to decide how to approach this increasingly perilous situation. There was no fear in Holmes's eyes, only cold calculation, the same look I had seen when he faced the most dangerous criminals of London. But beneath that calm exterior, I could sense his mind working furiously, analyzing every word, every gesture. Unravel everything? Holmes repeated slowly, as if testing the stranger's words. How so? What exactly are you implying? The stranger gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, as if he found amusement in Holmes's curiosity. I believe you already know more than you care to admit. The pendulum is not just a clock. It is a mechanism of great significance, a device of such power that it can alter the very fabric of time itself, a secret that has been guarded for centuries, hidden in plain sight. And now, Mr. Holmes, you have come dangerously close to uncovering it. Holmes's gaze sharpened. You speak of time manipulation as though it is fact, not theory. How can you be so certain? And more importantly, who exactly are you working for? The stranger's smile faded, replaced by a steely determination. I work for no one, Mr. Holmes. I simply serve a purpose, one that is far greater than you can comprehend, and I would suggest that you abandon this pursuit, lest you risk everything. I believe we've reached the point of understanding, Holmes replied, his tone now colder than ever. You are in possession of something dangerous, and I intend to uncover it. If you wish to threaten me further, I suggest you leave before you do so in earnest. The man seemed to weigh Holmes's words for a moment, his eyes flicking to Clara, who had been standing quietly by the door, her eyes wide with concern. She had remained silent throughout the exchange, but I could tell the tension in the room was starting to affect her. Very well, the stranger said finally, his voice low and measured. You are stubborn, Mr. Holmes, but understand this. The pendulum is not a toy. It is a key to something far greater than mere time, and those who seek it will pay a heavy price. With that, the stranger turned sharply and made his way to the door, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he reached the threshold, he paused, glancing over his shoulder one last time. Remember, Mr. Holmes, he said softly, the clock is ticking. With that, he was gone, disappearing into the night like a shadow, leaving us with nothing but the sound of the clock's ticking and the lingering tension in the air. Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his gaze fixed on the door through which the stranger had just exited. The clockmaker, meanwhile, remained quiet, his hands trembling as he adjusted a watch on the workbench, his eyes darting nervously between Holmes and Clara. Holmes finally spoke, his voice as calm as ever, though there was an unmistakable edge to his words. I believe our next course of action is clear. The pendulum is real, and it is far more dangerous than I had anticipated. We must find it before anyone else does, and I fear that our friend in the dark coat may not be the last to try and stop us. Clara nodded, her expression resolute. What do we do now? Holmes turned to her, his eyes sharp. We follow the trail wherever it leads, Miss Wetherell. If that means entering the lion's den, so be it, but we must act quickly. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes. The night was now fully upon us, and the fog had begun to roll in from the Thames, thickening the air and making the city seem as if it were drowning in a sea of mist. We stood in the clockmaker's shop, staring at the silent timepieces that lined the walls, wondering how much of what the stranger had said was true. Was the pendulum truly a device that could alter time itself? Could such a thing exist? Holmes was pacing now, his mind clearly in overdrive as he thought through every possible avenue. He turned to me, his eyes sharp. Watson, I need you to make discreet inquiries into any recent deaths or disappearances related to the clockmaker's family. We may find a link between the old clockmaker and the mysterious man who sought to warn us. And of course, we must find this pendulum before it falls into the wrong hands. Of course, Holmes, I replied. I will see what I can uncover, but I'm afraid we've only just begun to scratch the surface of this strange and dangerous case. Holmes nodded, his gaze fixed on the intricate machinery of the clocks that surrounded us. He reached out and picked up one of the timepieces, studying it intently. Indeed, Watson, but sometimes to find the answers, we must first understand the mechanisms that drive the mysteries. And in this case, the key is time itself. Chapter 6. The Pendulum's Shadow. The morning after the stranger's ominous visit arrived too quickly, bringing with it a sense of urgency that lingered in the fog-cloaked streets of London. Holmes and I had spent much of the night pondering the significance of the pendulum, the elusive timepiece that seemed to hold the key to this most perplexing case. Yet for all our deliberations, the answers remained just out of reach, like a distant clock chime heard through thick walls. Holmes, however, was far from discouraged. His mind was as sharp as ever, and though the case had taken a darker turn, his resolve to uncover the truth seemed only to strengthen. That morning, he had decided on a course of action, one that would bring us one step closer to understanding the mystery. "I believe we need to visit the Clockmaker's estate, Watson," Holmes said, his voice calm but with an unmistakable undercurrent of purpose. "There may be something there, something hidden away, that could provide us with the answers we seek. The Clockmaker's legacy is shrouded in secrecy, and I suspect that his death is not as simple as it seems." I nodded, despite the gnawing sense of unease in my gut. Something told me that the closer we got to the heart of this mystery, the more dangerous it would become. But I had no choice but to follow Holmes. I had seen firsthand how his deductive mind worked, and though I feared what lay ahead, I trusted in his judgment. We arrived at the Clockmaker's estate shortly after noon, the grand house looming before us like a monument to time itself. The estate was situated on the outskirts of London, nestled between thick trees and the occasional forgotten alleyway. The mansion's facade was both imposing and elegant, with tall windows and ornate detailing that spoke of a bygone era, one in which craftsmanship and precision were held in high regard. Holmes wasted no time in leading the way up the marble steps to the front door, his eyes scanning every inch of the property as we passed. He appeared unfazed by the grandeur of the place, his thoughts clearly focused on one thing: the hidden secrets that lay behind the estate's walls. "I suspect the Clockmaker's wealth was not merely accumulated through his craftsmanship," Holmes said, his voice low as we approached the door. "There is something more at play here, Watson. A legacy, perhaps a dangerous one, that I intend to uncover." I was about to respond when the door swung open, revealing a middle-aged butler whose eyes flicked nervously between us. Holmes wasted no time in introducing himself. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We are here on business regarding the late Mr. Edward Wetherell, the clockmaker. I trust you have no objections to our visit?" The butler, his face pale and strained, hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. "No objections, Mr. Holmes. But I must warn you, the house is not as it once was. The family has been in mourning, and the atmosphere is tense." Holmes nodded curtly, his expression unreadable as we stepped inside. The interior of the house was just as impressive as the exterior, though there was a palpable sense of melancholy in the air. Dust had settled on the furniture, and the once vibrant clocks on the walls had ceased ticking. The silence was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. We were led through a series of grand rooms, each one more ornate than the last, until we arrived at a large study. The room was dominated by a massive oak desk, behind which sat a portrait of the clockmaker, Edward Wetherell, his stern expression watching over the room. The walls were lined with bookshelves and timepieces of every imaginable design. It was here, in the heart of the clockmaker's domain, that Holmes seemed most at ease, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the room. "Do you see it, Watson?" Holmes murmured as he walked over to a large grandfather clock in the corner. Its hands frozen at precisely 3 o'clock. I followed him, my eyes narrowing as I looked at the timepiece. There was something unusual about it, something that didn't belong. "The pendulum, Watson," Holmes continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a message, hidden in plain sight. The time is a clue. The 3 o'clock hour, it's significant." I raised an eyebrow, unsure of what Holmes meant, but I didn't question him. Instead, I followed his gaze to a small compartment hidden behind the clock face. With deft hands, Holmes opened it, revealing a tiny, intricately carved box. Inside, wrapped in velvet, was an ornate timepiece, the pendulum itself. I could hardly contain my astonishment as Holmes held the object in his hands. It was beautiful, but it exuded an unsettling aura. The design was intricate, with delicate engravings of strange symbols that seemed to shift as the light hit them. The pendulum was small, no larger than a pocket watch, but it held an undeniable weight, both literally and figuratively. Holmes turned the timepiece over in his hands, examining it with a careful scrutiny that betrayed the significance of what he had just found. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is the heart of the mystery. But what it truly means, we can only begin to understand." I felt a chill run down my spine as I glanced at the clock on the wall, its frozen hands still pointing to 3 o'clock. The pendulum in Holmes's hand seemed to hum with a strange energy, as though it held the key to something far greater than we had yet realized. Just as I was about to speak, the door to the study creaked open, and the butler reappeared. His face was even more ashen than before, his eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice trembling, "there is someone at the gate. They've been watching the house." Holmes's eyes snapped to the butler, his expression instantly hardening. "Who is it?" he demanded, his voice cold. I don't know, sir," the butler stammered, his gaze flicking nervously toward the window. "But they've been there for hours, just standing, watching." Without another word, Holmes moved swiftly to the window, peering through the heavy curtains. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the yard, and I followed his gaze. There, in the distance, was a figure, dressed in a long coat, standing motionless by the wrought iron gate, watching the house. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice low and tense, "we've been discovered. I believe our visitor is none other than the man from last night, the one who warned us about the pendulum." I felt a wave of unease wash over me. What do we do now? Holmes's eyes never left the figure outside. "We confront him, Watson, but carefully. He is not a man to be underestimated." Chapter 7. The Visitor at the Gate. Holmes stood motionless by the window, his keen eyes scanning the figure outside. The figure, tall and gaunt, appeared to be standing in the same position as before, perfectly still, as if he were a statue or part of the landscape itself. His long coat fluttered slightly in the cold breeze, but otherwise, he did not move. It was a strange sight, and one that filled me with an uneasy foreboding. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice low as I tried to peer through the glass. "Do you know him, Holmes?" Holmes did not immediately respond. His gaze remained locked on the figure outside, and his brow furrowed in concentration. It was clear he was piecing together a puzzle, some fragment of the mystery that had eluded him up to that point. For a moment, I thought he might not answer me, but then he spoke, his voice measured, almost as if to himself. "It is him," he murmured, barely audible. "The one who warned us, the one who knows more than he lets on." I frowned. "But who is he? Why has he been following us?" Holmes finally tore his eyes away from the window and turned toward me. His expression was grim, as though he had come to some conclusion that both puzzled and disturbed him. "He is connected to the Clockmaker, Watson. More than I initially believed. Perhaps even more than I would have liked." Holmes walked away from the window, moving toward the door, his gait deliberate and purposeful. "We must speak with him, of course, but I would prefer to do so on my terms." I followed closely behind him, unsure of what was about to transpire. We descended the stairs in silence, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. The house seemed to grow darker, more oppressive with each step we took. By the time we reached the front door, I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, and my pulse quickened. This was no ordinary visit, no simple exchange of words. Whatever was about to unfold, it would have consequences far beyond what either Holmes or I could have anticipated. The butler opened the door for us, his face pale and drawn. He looked as though he had seen a ghost. "Mr. Holmes," he whispered. "He's still out there, standing by the gate. I don't know what to do." Holmes did not reply, his gaze hard and unyielding. With a swift motion, he stepped outside onto the stoop, and I, though hesitant, followed. The cold air hit me immediately, sharp and biting. It seemed to magnify the tension in the air, filling the space between us with an invisible pressure. We made our way across the gravel path that led to the iron gate. The figure stood at the far end of the drive, watching us intently. Now that I had a clearer view of him, I could see that his face was obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but his posture was unnerving, rigid like a sentry on guard. Holmes stopped a few paces from the gate, his hands clasped behind his back, and stood in a relaxed but alert stance. He didn't speak immediately, merely observing the figure with his trademark intensity. I could feel the silence stretching between them, and I found myself holding my breath unsure of what would happen next. The figure finally moved, his movements slow and deliberate. He took a single step forward, but no more. His voice, when it came, was deep and rich, tinged with a faint foreign accent that I couldn't quite place. "I had hoped you would be wiser, Mr. Holmes," he said, his tone soft yet chilling. "But I see now that your curiosity will be your undoing." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a subtle smile that betrayed nothing of the discomfort that the stranger's words might have caused. "You underestimate me, sir," Holmes replied, his voice steady and calm. "I have no intention of backing away from this case. You would be wise to explain yourself." The stranger's gaze flicked toward the pendulum in Holmes's pocket, the small, delicate timepiece now tucked safely away, but still evident in the way Holmes carried himself. The stranger seemed to focus on it for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You are too clever by half, Holmes," the man said, almost to himself. Then, louder, he added, "But I will tell you this. You are meddling with forces far beyond your comprehension. This is no mere case of murder or theft. This is about legacy, power, and secrets that have been buried for decades." Holmes tilted his head slightly, intrigued but still cautious. "I am well aware that there is more to this than meets the eye, but you have not yet answered my question. Who are you, and what is your connection to the late Mr. Wetherell?" The stranger's lips curled into a half smile, but it was devoid of warmth. "You really don't know, do you?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. "Mr. Wetherell's death was no accident, no natural cause, as you so boldly claimed. But you are right about one thing. I do know the truth. I know the legacy of his craft, and I know what it means to possess such power." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes keen and piercing. "Then tell me what you know, and let us see if it matches my own deductions." The stranger paused for a moment, his eyes glancing briefly at the gate, as though considering something. He seemed to wrestle with an inner conflict, then took a step closer, his voice dropping lower. "Very well, Holmes. I shall tell you this, though it may be more than you are prepared to hear." He glanced behind him, his eyes lingering on the dark street beyond the gate. Then, with a conspiratorial look, he continued, "The pendulum is not merely a piece of craftsmanship. It is the key to unlocking a vast fortune, a treasure that has been hidden for generations. Edward Wetherell was not merely a clockmaker, Mr. Holmes. He was the keeper of an ancient secret, a secret that many would kill to possess. And now that he is dead, the search for that treasure has begun. I was one of the few who knew of its existence. But I am not alone. There are others, and they will stop at nothing to find it." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. The mystery, which had seemed so focused on a single murder, now stretched out into something far greater. A treasure, hidden for generations. This was a different kind of case altogether. Holmes, his mind whirring with possibilities, spoke again, his voice soft but firm. "I see. So you are part of this group that seeks the treasure. But why warn me? Why not simply eliminate me?" The stranger's gaze darkened, and for the first time I saw a flash of something almost akin to fear. "Because, Holmes, you are not like the others. You are dangerous. Your mind is a threat to those who wish to possess what they cannot understand. But be warned, if you pursue this any further, you will find yourself tangled in a web of deceit, betrayal, and death." With that, the stranger turned abruptly, his long coat billowing in the wind as he began to walk away. Holmes didn't follow him immediately. Instead, he stood there, watching the figure retreat into the shadows of the street, the mystery deepening with each passing moment. "Well, Watson," Holmes finally said, breaking the heavy silence. "It seems we have been handed another clue, though I fear the path ahead is far more treacherous than we first imagined." I nodded, my mind racing. The pendulum, the treasure, the family legacy, it was all coming together, yet nothing was clear. What was the truth? Who could be trusted? And what price would we pay for uncovering the secret hidden within the clockmaker's legacy? "Where do we go from here?" I asked. Holmes turned toward the house, his expression resolute. "We continue, Watson. We dig deeper. The game has just begun." Chapter 8: The Pendulum's Toll. The morning following our encounter with the shadowed figure was overcast, and the air was thick with the lingering weight of uncertainty. We stood in the drawing room of 221B Baker Street, the faint tick-tock of Holmes's collection of clocks providing an eerie soundtrack to our thoughts. Holmes paced back and forth, his brow furrowed, his mind a swirl of possibilities. I, on the other hand, was still grappling with the implications of what the stranger had said. The treasure, the pendulum, it was all too much to absorb in one go. Holmes's voice broke the silence, cutting through my reverie. Watson, we must move quickly. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this will become. You are correct in your assessment. The treasure is no mere object of curiosity. Thus, it is a key to something much greater, something far more significant than I initially realized. I nodded, unsure of where to begin. But Holmes, how do we even begin to trace something like this? The pendulum is the key, but what is the lock? And who else could possibly be after it? Holmes stopped in his tracks, his piercing eyes locking onto mine, as if he had just made a critical connection. I have a theory, Watson, but it requires us to return to Wetherell's workshop, the place where we found him dead. There is something there, something hidden in plain sight, that will provide us with the answers we seek. I looked at him, perplexed. You mean to return to the scene of the crime? After everything that's happened? Holmes gave me a thin smile, the faintest hint of excitement in his voice. Yes, Watson, precisely. We must examine it from a new perspective, one that accounts for what we now know. It is only by returning to the place where it all began that we can unravel the mystery and understand the true nature of the pendulum. The streets of London were damp, the fog rolling in from the river and coating everything in a thick, almost suffocating veil. The sense of foreboding that had settled over us since our encounter with the stranger deepened as we made our way toward Wetherell's workshop, located in a narrow alley not far from the docks. The closer we got, the more the air seemed to change, growing heavier, laden with the secrets of the past. As we reached the door of the workshop, Holmes paused, his hand hovering just above the brass handle. "Be cautious, Watson," he murmured. "We do not know who might be watching us, or who might have already been here." I nodded, though a sense of unease prickled at the back of my neck. Holmes's instincts had rarely led him astray, but this time there was something different about the case. It felt as though we were teetering on the edge of a precipice, about to uncover something that would change everything. With a sharp twist of the handle, the door creaked open, and we stepped inside. The room smelled of old wood and metal, the remnants of Wetherell's craft still lingering in the air. The large workbench at the center of the room was cluttered with gears, cogs, and unfinished timepieces, all in various stages of construction. It was an overwhelming sight, and for a moment, I wondered how Wetherell had managed to maintain any order amidst the chaos. Holmes moved swiftly, his eyes scanning the room, his mind already racing with thoughts I could not yet follow. "There is something important here," he muttered under his breath. "Something that will reveal the truth." I stood back, watching as he approached the workbench. His fingers moved with practiced precision, lifting the various objects, examining them, and then setting them down again. There was an urgency to his movements, as though he were searching for a needle in a haystack, but he did not stop. He had a purpose, and I knew better than to interrupt him when his mind was so absorbed in its work. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Holmes stopped in front of a small, half-finished clock. He tilted his head, studying it with a keen eye, before reaching down and carefully lifting it from the table. His expression shifted from concentration to something more. Calculating. "This is it," he said softly, almost to himself. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, stepping forward. I peered over his shoulder, but saw nothing particularly remarkable about the clock, nothing that would explain his sudden sense of revelation. Holmes turned to me, his face alight with a mixture of excitement and something darker, perhaps recognition. "This clock is not just any clock, Watson. It is a mechanism designed to conceal something hidden within its gears, its springs, and its pendulum." Before I could respond, Holmes had already begun to dismantle the clock with the deftness of a master. His fingers worked quickly, pulling apart the delicate components, each piece revealing another hidden secret. I watched, entranced, as he meticulously searched for the concealed compartment, and then, after a few moments, he found it. At the center of the clock, hidden within the pivoting gears, was a small metal box. Narrow, intricate, and old. Holmes carefully pried it free and held it in his hand, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "There it is," he said, his voice low. "The key to everything." I took a step closer, my curiosity piqued. "What is it, Holmes? What's inside?" Holmes's fingers worked the latch of the box, and it opened with a soft click. Inside, nestled among a bed of velvet, was a rolled-up parchment, a letter, yellowed with age and covered in fine, almost unintelligible script. "This, Watson," Holmes said, his voice tinged with awe, "is the true legacy of Edward Wetherell." As Holmes carefully unrolled the parchment, he handed it to me. My eyes scanned the delicate handwriting, but I could make little sense of it at first glance. The letters were oddly shaped, and the language seemed archaic, like something from a forgotten era. But even in my confusion, I could sense the importance of the document. Holmes, however, had already deciphered it. His lips moved as he read silently, his brow furrowing with each passing line. When he finally looked up, his face was pale, his expression darker than I had ever seen it before. "Watson," he said, his voice grave, "this is no ordinary letter. It contains instructions, directions, in fact, leading to the treasure we've been hearing about. But what's more, it is clear that Wetherell did not die by accident. He was murdered to prevent this very document from reaching anyone else." I felt a chill run down my spine. The web of deception was thickening, and we were now fully entangled in it. "We need to take this to Lestrade," Holmes said suddenly, his voice sharp with urgency. "We must inform him, though I fear he will not fully grasp the significance of this discovery. But we can't wait any longer. Whoever is after this treasure will stop at nothing to find it. We must act, and quickly." It was clear now that our investigation had shifted into more dangerous territory. The pendulum was no longer just a timepiece. It was a key to an ancient mystery, one that spanned generations. And as we prepared to leave Wetherell's workshop, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what we were about to undertake. The Clockmaker's legacy had become far more than just a case. It was a race against time. Chapter 9. The Secrets of the Pendulum. The fog had not lifted as we made our way back to Baker Street, and the streets of London felt even more oppressive under its cloak. I could sense that Holmes's thoughts were consumed by the puzzle we had just unearthed. An ancient treasure, an unsolved murder, and now the revelation of a hidden letter, one that spoke of things far older than we had first anticipated. There was more to this case than either of us could have imagined. Holmes was unusually quiet as we climbed the stairs to our rooms, his long coat trailing behind him like a shadow. I had seen him in many states of mind, but this seemed different. He was not merely intrigued, but deeply unsettled by what lay ahead. And the stakes were higher now. The pendulum was no longer simply a timepiece, but a catalyst for something far more dangerous. As we entered our sitting room, Holmes gestured for me to sit, his expression grave. "Watson, we are no longer merely investigating a murder. We are involved in something far more significant. Something that touches upon the very foundations of an ancient and powerful secret." I sat across from him, waiting for him to elaborate. He didn't keep me in suspense for long. Edward Wetherell was not the first to hold the secret of the pendulum. It is clear now that he inherited it from someone else, someone who, many years ago, began this puzzle, setting in motion a chain of events that led to his death. The letter we found was not just an account of the treasure, Watson. It was a map, an encoded guide that will lead us to the heart of this mystery. I leaned forward, eager to understand. And the murderer, Holmes? Who would go to such lengths to conceal this treasure? And why? Holmes leaned back, his gaze drifting to the clock on the mantel, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered the question. I believe the answer lies in the legacy of the pendulum itself. The treasure is not merely gold or jewels. It is something much rarer, something whose value transcends material wealth. Whoever controls the pendulum controls knowledge. Knowledge of an ancient order, a secret society that has operated in the shadows for centuries. I felt a shiver run down my spine. And Wetherell, he was merely a custodian of this knowledge? Exactly, Holmes said. But it seems he was not the only one. There are others, Watson. Others who will stop at nothing to retrieve the pendulum, to claim its power for themselves. The murder was not a random act. Wetherell's death was meticulously planned. And now, It is our job to find the key to this mystery before it falls into the wrong hands. There was a knock at the door, pulling us both from our thoughts. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face drawn with concern. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's someone here to see you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "A gentleman, a Mr. Lestrade." Holmes's face hardened slightly at the mention of the detective inspector's name. "Send him in, Mrs. Hudson," he replied, his tone cool. Lestrade entered the room moments later, his face flushed with either anger or anxiety, though it was difficult to tell which. He was holding a letter, its edges crumpled as though he had been gripping it tightly. "Holmes, Watson," Lestrade said, his voice laced with frustration. "I need your help. Something strange has been happening at the yard, and I can't make heads or tails of it." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Go on, Lestrade. What's happened?" Lestrade handed the letter to Holmes, who took it without comment. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the contents as Lestrade spoke. "We've received word of several disappearances in the area surrounding the docks. Several respectable merchants, men of influence, have gone missing over the past few days. There are no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. But something isn't right, Holmes. It's like they vanished into thin air." Holmes's eyes flicked back to Lestrade. "What makes you think this is connected to our case?" Lestrade hesitated. "We don't know yet, but there's something strange about the timing. Wetherell's death, these disappearances, it all seems to be linked. And the letter? Well, it mentions the pendulum." I watched as Holmes's expression darkened. He had always been quick to connect the dots, but this revelation seemed to hit him with particular force. "I see," he said, his voice colder now. "The pendulum is more than just a relic. It's a symbol, a signal to those who know its significance." Lestrade looked confused. "What do you mean, Holmes? What's all this talk of a symbol?" Holmes stood and walked over to the mantel, his fingers brushing lightly against the various clocks that adorned it. "The pendulum, Lestrade, is the key to something much larger than you realize. The disappearances, the murder, these are not random events. They are part of a carefully orchestrated plan." He turned to face Lestrade, his gaze piercing. "The pendulum is not simply a timepiece. It is a weapon, a key to unlocking something far more powerful than we can yet comprehend." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "And you're saying this has something to do with the missing men?" "I am saying that the missing men are not just victims. They are participants," Holmes said. "They were taken because they were part of the puzzle. They had something to do with the secret society that guards the pendulum's power." Lestrade looked at Holmes as though he were mad. "You're suggesting a secret society? You honestly believe this is the work of some shadowy group?" Holmes nodded. "I do. And I believe they are watching us, Lestrade. Watching and waiting for the moment to strike." Lestrade sat back in his chair, his expression hardening. "I want to help you, Holmes, but I need more than just theory. We need evidence." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, are you ready?" I nodded, my mind already racing with the possibilities. "Where do we start?" Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "We go to the docks, Watson. We follow the trail of the missing men. We find out who is behind this. And we uncover the true power of the pendulum." The fog was even thicker as we made our way down to the docks later that evening. The streetlights flickered in the murky haze, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly along the cobbled streets. The docks were a labyrinth of warehouses and narrow alleys, and I couldn't help but feel that we were being watched. Holmes led the way, his footsteps quick and purposeful. I followed closely behind, my senses alert to every sound, every movement in the darkened streets. "Stay close, Watson," Holmes murmured. "We are nearing the heart of the mystery now." We reached a secluded warehouse, its windows dark and its door unmarked. Holmes hesitated for a moment before giving a single nod. He motioned for me to follow him inside. As we stepped through the door, the faint hum of activity echoed through the cavernous space. There were figures moving in the shadows, unseen, but unmistakably present. Holmes turned to me, his expression grim. "This is it, Watson. The center of the storm. We must tread carefully from here." Before I could reply, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and I could see the adrenaline coursing through him. "We're not alone," he whispered. "Get ready." The air was thick with tension as the figures drew closer. Holmes's eyes flickered to the shadows, his sharp mind calculating the danger with remarkable precision. I could hear the sound of footsteps growing louder, more deliberate. They were not the quick, unsteady steps of a frightened man, but the measured approach of someone with a purpose. Someone who knew they were not being followed, or perhaps even expected us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the fog outside had seeped into the very heart of the warehouse. "Stay behind me, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice calm, but with a tinge of steel. "We need to remain unseen for now." I nodded, my hand instinctively moving towards the revolver tucked beneath my coat. It wasn't often I felt the need to arm myself in Holmes's presence, but something about the atmosphere tonight was different. The stakes were much higher than either of us had initially believed. The footsteps stopped just beyond our vision. A low voice rang out, though muffled by the space between us. "Is the pendulum in place?" Holmes's eyes widened slightly, his hand making a subtle gesture to motion me forward. We moved quietly toward the sound, staying low to avoid being detected. I could see his mind racing, processing every detail, every possible clue. Before Holmes could give further instructions, a figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall, wearing a long dark coat, the collar turned up to shield his face from view. His presence alone commanded attention, and there was something unmistakably dangerous about him. Holmes stepped forward, his voice smooth and confident. "I presume you're the one responsible for the disappearances and the murder of Edward Wetherell?" The man's gaze shifted quickly, his eyes flicking toward Holmes with a mixture of surprise and interest. "Sherlock Holmes, I presume," he replied in a deep, unsettling voice. His tone was calculating, as if he had expected our arrival all along. Holmes didn't flinch. "You seem to be well informed," he observed, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man, "but perhaps not as much as you think. You see, I know something you don't, something you'd rather keep hidden." The man's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Is that so?" he replied. "And what, pray tell, is it that you know?" Holmes took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the man. "I know that the pendulum is not merely a timepiece," he said, his voice low and commanding. "It's a key, one that unlocks secrets that should never be uncovered. And you, my dear sir, are part of something much older and far more dangerous than you realize." The man's expression shifted. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, but it was gone too quickly for me to interpret. He remained silent for a long moment, his gaze lingering on Holmes. "You are quite perceptive," he said slowly, his tone shifting from amusement to something darker. "But you are not as clever as you think, Holmes." Holmes's eyes never left the man, though his mind was clearly racing through the possibilities. I could see him calculating each move, each word, as if the entire conversation were a chess match. It was a rare moment when Holmes did not seem to be in control, but this man, this shadowy figure, was challenging him in ways I had never seen before. "You have been playing a dangerous game, Holmes," the man continued. "But you are out of your depth. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Before Holmes could respond, the man raised a hand, signaling something unseen in the darkness. The sound of movement reverberated through the warehouse, and I could sense more figures emerging from the shadows, flanking us. It was clear now. This was no ordinary operation. Holmes's eyes flicked toward me, and in that brief moment, I could see the resolve in his gaze. He had already assessed the situation, and there was no hesitation in his stance. We were trapped, yes, but we were not defeated. "Watson," Holmes said calmly, "we'll need to move quickly. Get ready." I nodded, my heart racing as I prepared myself for whatever was about to come. This was no longer a simple investigation. It was a battle for survival. Suddenly, one of the figures lunged toward us, a glinting blade flashing in the dim light. Holmes reacted faster than I could follow, his hand coming up to block the strike, using his cane with a fluid motion that left the attacker stumbling back in surprise. Holmes's eyes never wavered as he continued to face the man, his movements precise and calculated. "Careful, Watson," Holmes warned, his voice calm in the midst of the chaos. "It seems they're intent on making this a more personal matter." I instinctively drew my revolver, aiming at the nearest figure who had begun to circle us. The tension in the air was palpable. The figures were closing in, and there was no way to know how many more were lurking in the shadows. But just as quickly as the danger had escalated, it dissipated. A loud crash rang through the warehouse, followed by a shout from one of the attackers. Holmes's face lit up with a flicker of recognition. "Lestrade," he murmured under his breath. Through the fog, we could see the familiar form of Detective Inspector Lestrade leading a small group of constables charging into the warehouse. They had arrived just in time, and their presence tipped the scales in our favor. The attackers hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to proceed, before bolting into the darkness. But Holmes had already taken advantage of the distraction, springing into action and capturing the man he had been speaking to. With a swift motion, Holmes knocked the man to the ground, pinning him with a strength that surprised even me. The man struggled, but Holmes's grip was firm, and the moment he was subdued, Lestrade's constables were upon him, restraining him and hauling him to his feet. Holmes stood up, brushing off his coat. "Well, that was a bit too close for comfort, Watson," he said, his voice calm as if nothing out of the ordinary had just transpired. Lestrade walked over to Holmes, his face a mixture of relief and exasperation. "Holmes, you've gone too far this time. This is getting far too dangerous. What are you involved in now?" Holmes gave him a knowing smile, one that was part amusement, part seriousness. "You'll find out soon enough, Lestrade. But for now, we have a great deal to learn from this gentleman, don't we?" The man who had been subdued said nothing, his eyes burning with fury. But Holmes was undeterred. He turned to me, his gaze thoughtful. "Watson, I believe we've reached the tipping point of this case," Holmes said. "The pendulum is no longer just a mystery. It is a key to something much darker, and I am certain we will uncover the truth soon enough." Lestrade shook his head in disbelief. "I don't know how you do it, Holmes, but I've had enough of this, for tonight at least." Holmes turned to the detective, his voice firm. "You will stay close, Lestrade. This is far from over. I suspect we will be seeing more of these gentlemen in the very near future." Chapter 10. The Clockwork Conspiracy. The dim light of the gas lamps flickered as the rain pattered down on the cobblestone streets outside the warehouse. The night felt unusually still, as if the very air were holding its breath. Even in the hustle and bustle of London, there were moments when time seemed to slow, moments when every shadow, every footstep, every breath became a warning. Inside the warehouse, the figures that had attacked us earlier had been swiftly subdued. The man Holmes had pinned to the floor was now sitting in a chair, his hands bound behind him. His expression was a mixture of defiance and frustration, though he had yet to speak a word since his capture. The others had been captured by Lestrade's constables and were being interrogated in separate rooms. Holmes stood near the table, examining a collection of papers he had taken from the man's coat pockets. The soft scratch of Holmes's pen against the paper was the only sound in the room as he meticulously wrote down every detail. "Holmes," I began, my voice quiet, "what do you think this man's connection is to the pendulum? What does he know about Edward Wetherell's death?" Holmes didn't immediately answer. He was absorbed in his task, his mind working at full capacity. He flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing as he read each one with great care. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "I've been considering that, Watson," he said, his voice thoughtful. "The pendulum, as we've discovered, is no mere timepiece. It is part of a much larger puzzle. And this man, he is more than just an ordinary conspirator. He is someone who has been intricately woven into a network of influence, power, and secrecy. But who he works for is still a mystery." I stepped closer, my eyes falling on the papers Holmes had been reading. There were intricate diagrams, blueprints of sorts, some of which appeared to be related to clockmaking. The rest were written in a cipher, their meaning unclear. Holmes handed me one of the papers, his eyes sharp and intense. "Take a look at this, Watson. It appears that the pendulum itself is only a small part of a far greater scheme. This cipher might hold the key to unraveling everything." I glanced down at the sheet, the symbols and letters dancing before my eyes like a riddle. It was a code, but it was unlike anything I had ever encountered. I handed it back to Holmes, unable to make sense of it myself. "I take it this is no ordinary cipher," I remarked, my voice tinged with frustration. Holmes smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. No, Watson, it is not. This is a clockmaker's cipher, designed specifically to confuse and mislead anyone who does not understand the intricacies of timepiece mechanisms. But I have seen this code before, though not in a long while. It was used by a group of operatives I encountered during my time in the East. They were master craftsmen, specializing in the construction of timepieces that concealed far more than the simple ticking of time. A sudden realization hit me. You think this network, this operation, is connected to the ones you uncovered in the East? Holmes's eyes met mine, his expression solemn. Exactly. And if that is the case, then we are dealing with something far more dangerous than I initially anticipated. This is no mere criminal organization. It is a carefully constructed web of individuals who use clockmaking as a front for much darker pursuits. Edward Wetherell's death was not a coincidence. He knew something important, and he was silenced before he could reveal it. Lestrade's voice interrupted our conversation. Holmes, I've got something, he said, his tone tense. He entered the room, his face grim. One of the other men we captured, he's been talking, says he knows where the pendulum is headed next. Holmes looked up, his eyes narrowing with interest. Where? Lestrade hesitated for a moment before replying. To the West End. A place called the Winding Key. It's an old clockmaker's shop, one that's been closed for years. According to our man, that's where the pendulum is being stored. The name struck a chord with me. I knew the area well. The Winding Key was a legendary clockmaker's establishment, founded by the famous Tobias Granger, a man renowned for his ability to craft timepieces of incredible precision. However, the shop had been abandoned for more than a decade, ever since Granger had mysteriously vanished without a trace. Do you think this Tobias Granger is involved in the operation? I asked, my curiosity piqued. Holmes's gaze flickered toward Lestrade, then back to me. It's possible, Watson. Granger was a master clockmaker, and his expertise would be highly valuable to any group with designs on using timepieces for nefarious purposes. If the pendulum is indeed being stored there, then it could very well be the linchpin in this entire operation. Lestrade shook his head in disbelief. This is starting to sound like some sort of conspiracy, Holmes, but we have no time to waste. The pendulum might be gone by the time we get there. Holmes stood up, his eyes cold and determined. Then we'll make sure it isn't. Gather your men, Lestrade. We have a rendezvous in the West End. The rain was falling harder now as we made our way to the Winding Key. Holmes was unusually quiet, his mind undoubtedly racing through the possible scenarios. I, on the other hand, could not shake the feeling of impending danger that hung in the air. The West End was a stark contrast to the foggy, damp streets of the city. It was a place of opulence, of theatergoers and merchants, of high society and hidden secrets. As we approached the old clockmaker's shop, I noticed that the once grand storefront was now dark and desolate, its windows cracked and its sign hanging askew. Lestrade and his constables fanned out around the building, while Holmes and I approached the front door. Holmes knelt down, examining the lock, before rising and turning to me. "This is recent," he said, his voice low. "The door's been forced. Someone's been here, and it wasn't long ago." With a firm push, Holmes opened the door. The creak of the hinges echoed through the abandoned shop. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Shelves once lined with beautiful timepieces were now barren, the shop having been stripped of its valuable inventory long ago. But in the back corner of the room, something caught my eye. A large wooden chest covered in grime and cobwebs stood beneath a tall, antique grandfather clock. The chest was old, its metal locks rusted with age, but there was something unmistakably odd about it. It seemed out of place, as though it had been deliberately hidden from view. "Holmes," I whispered, nodding toward the chest. Holmes's eyes darted to the object, and without a word, he moved toward it, his every step measured and deliberate. He crouched down, his fingers working deftly as he examined the chest's locks. With a final satisfying click, the chest opened, revealing its contents. Inside, nestled carefully within layers of velvet and gold cloth, was the pendulum. It was a masterpiece, its gears and cogs intricately woven together, gleaming in the dim light. But it wasn't just a timepiece. It was something far more complex. As Holmes gently lifted it from the chest, his face darkened. "This is it, Watson," he said softly, his voice tinged with awe and unease. "This is the key to everything." Chapter 11. The Secrets Within the Pendulum. The pendulum was heavy in Holmes's hands, its brass casing gleaming under the faint glow of the gas lamps filtering in through the cracked windows of the winding key. It was a thing of unparalleled craftsmanship, its gears and mechanisms intricate, yet its design was clearly not meant to simply keep time. There was a mystery within its clockwork, a purpose far greater than just marking the hours. Holmes studied the device intently, his eyes scanning its surface with the precision of a master craftsman. He turned it over, tracing his fingers along the delicate engravings, and after a moment, his expression shifted from one of intrigue to concern. "I had suspected as much," Holmes muttered under his breath, "but I didn't realize just how deeply this has been hidden." "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "What is it that you see?" Holmes lifted the pendulum to eye level, inspecting it with the utmost scrutiny. "This, Watson, is not merely a timepiece. It is a coded message in and of itself, a device to conceal something of immense value. And it has been constructed in a manner to ensure that only a select few could ever hope to decipher its secrets." I could see the weight of his words sink in, and I wondered how many others had come into contact with this object, unaware of its significance. What was hidden within it? What had Edward Wetherell known? Lestrade entered the room then, his brow furrowed, his voice tense. "Holmes, we've secured the rest of the premises. There's no sign of anyone else. No other conspirators hiding in the shop. But you'd best take a look at this." Holmes set the pendulum down carefully on the counter and stepped over to Lestrade. I followed, my eyes lingering on the device as Holmes adjusted his glasses and peered over the constable's shoulder. In Lestrade's hand was a small, folded piece of parchment, its edges yellowed and frayed. "What have you found?" Holmes asked, his voice steady. "It's a letter, Holmes. A rather peculiar one at that," Lestrade said, carefully unfolding the paper. "It was hidden inside the walls of the shop, just behind where the clock was mounted." Holmes took the letter from Lestrade, his fingers gently brushing the paper as he unfolded it. The ink was faded, but still legible, the handwriting flowing and elegant, but there was something unmistakable about it. The letter contained references to the pendulum, the inheritance, and a series of numbers. "I knew it," Holmes murmured, his voice soft. "This letter was written by Tobias Granger himself, and it confirms my suspicions. The pendulum is not just a timepiece. It's a key." I peered over Holmes's shoulder at the letter, straining to make sense of the words. "A key to what?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with a mixture of excitement and frustration. "The pendulum is part of a larger puzzle, Watson. Granger constructed it as a means of protecting something, a treasure perhaps, or a secret of immense power. The key he refers to in this letter is not just metaphorical, it is literal." He paused, his mind evidently racing through the possibilities. "But this cipher, it's not just numbers, it's coordinates. Hidden within these calculations is the location of something. Something Granger wanted kept from the world." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "So you think Granger was involved in something far more dangerous than just clockmaking?" Holmes's gaze never left the letter. "Yes, Granger wasn't just a craftsman. He was an architect of secrets, a man with access to powerful people, and evidently, a man who knew how to hide his knowledge in plain sight. The pendulum was the perfect disguise, a timepiece that could be passed off as a mere clock. But its true purpose was to hide its message. It's the final piece of a much larger scheme." I took a step back, letting Holmes's words sink in. The pendulum, Edward Wetherell's mysterious death, the cipher in the clockmaker's workshop. These threads were weaving a picture I was only just beginning to understand. There were too many questions, too many unanswered mysteries. "What now, Holmes?" I asked. "How do we find the treasure Granger hid, or whatever it is that he wanted to protect?" Holmes took a deep breath, his fingers tapping against the letter. "The first step, Watson, is to decode the cipher. The numbers here are not random. They correspond to something, perhaps a place, or perhaps even a time. Once we decipher it, we will have our answer." "But who else knows about this?" Lestrade asked, his voice gruff. "And how many others are out there searching for whatever Granger hid?" "That," Holmes replied, turning to face him, "is exactly what we need to determine. And I suspect that we're not the only ones who have been watching the pendulum. Others have been involved in this conspiracy, ones who are willing to go to great lengths to keep the secret buried. The hours passed in a blur as Holmes worked tirelessly, hunched over the desk, his mind consumed with the cipher. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the final picture was still obscured, shrouded in secrecy. Lestrade had ordered his men to search the shop for anything else that could provide a clue, but it was clear that the real answers lay with the pendulum itself. I sat in the corner, watching as Holmes worked, feeling the weight of the case settle heavily on my shoulders. We had come so far, but the road ahead seemed even darker, filled with more questions than answers. What was Granger hiding? What did the numbers mean? And who else was involved in this tangled web of conspiracy? Holmes finally sat back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "It's done, Watson. I've cracked the cipher." I stood up quickly, my heart racing. "What does it say?" Holmes looked at me, a mixture of satisfaction and concern in his gaze. "The numbers correspond to a location, Watson, a place hidden beneath the very streets of London, a location known only to a few, but the real question is whether we'll be able to reach it before someone else does." Lestrade's voice interrupted, his tone tense. "Holmes, we've got a problem." "What is it?" Holmes asked, his gaze fixed on the constable. "We've just received word," Lestrade said, his face grim. "Someone beat us to the location. They've already moved in." Holmes's expression hardened. "Then we have no time to lose. Gather your men, Lestrade. We're going after them." Chapter 12. The Underground Chase. The cold London evening air greeted us as we rushed out of the winding quay, our footsteps echoing against the cobblestone streets. The tension hung heavy in the air, thick with anticipation. Holmes's eyes gleamed with purpose, but there was something else, something I hadn't seen before. It was a calculated urgency, a spark that betrayed his belief that time was rapidly running out. Lestrade and his officers flanked us, all of them moving with grim determination. The constable's usual bluster was gone, replaced by a rare professionalism. The information we had uncovered had led us to an underground location somewhere in the heart of London, a place that, according to the cipher, was hidden beneath layers of old brick and stone. "Holmes," Lestrade said, voice low but urgent. "The report said that a group of men was seen entering the building shortly before we arrived. We've no idea how many are inside or what they're after. They know we're on their trail now." Holmes gave a terse nod. "Then we must move swiftly. These men are not just common criminals. The cipher suggests that they are after something far more dangerous." I glanced at Holmes, wondering just how deep this rabbit hole would go. The mystery had unraveled to reveal not only a hidden treasure, but also a secret society, one that had been waiting for the right moment to strike. What were they protecting? What would they do to keep it buried? As we rounded a corner near the docks, the streets grew quieter, the buildings taller and older. This part of London, away from the bustle of the city center, held a certain quiet menace. It was a place where secrets thrived in the shadows, and whispers of forgotten crimes still lingered in the fog. Holmes had already begun to direct Lestrade's men in a manner that indicated he had a clear strategy. His mind, as always, was working several steps ahead of everyone else. We would infiltrate the underground location, find the treasure, or whatever it was they were hiding, and confront the people behind this conspiracy. As we approached a nondescript building nestled between a row of darkened warehouses, Holmes stopped abruptly. He raised a hand, signaling for us to halt. "Lestrade, take your men around the back. I'll go in through the front. Watson, stay with me." "Are you sure, Holmes?" I asked, feeling a surge of unease. "It could be dangerous in there." Holmes gave me a wry smile. "When has danger ever deterred us, Watson?" He turned to face the constable. "But be prepared. We may need to move quickly. If these men are as dangerous as I suspect, we will have little time to waste." Lestrade gave a quick nod, then motioned to his officers. They dispersed without a word, heading toward the alleyways to secure the rear entrance. Holmes and I moved toward the front door, and as we approached, I felt my pulse quicken. The atmosphere felt heavier with each step. Holmes's eyes narrowed, scanning the dark windows above. "They know we're coming," he muttered. "They've already covered their tracks, but we still have the advantage." Before I could ask him what he meant, Holmes pulled out a small blackened device, a lock-picking tool, and approached the door. He worked with practiced efficiency, and within moments, the door creaked open. We stepped inside, the sound of the hinges echoing eerily in the stillness. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew, the scent of an old, forgotten place. But it was the silence that was most unsettling. Holmes moved forward with measured steps, his eyes scanning the darkness. I followed closely, trying to make out any movement or sign of life. "Stay sharp," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible. "We may be walking into a trap." As we moved deeper into the building, it became clear that the space we had entered was not a typical warehouse. The walls were lined with shelves stacked with strange mechanical objects, clocks, pendulums, and even some bizarre sculptures. But none of them seemed to have a functional purpose. "What is this place?" I muttered under my breath. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He was too busy inspecting the walls, the floors, the ceiling. His eyes were alight with the same spark of curiosity that had led him into countless mysteries before. "I don't know yet," he replied, his voice tinged with excitement. "But I suspect it's not just the treasure we are after. This building, this place, it has the feel of a hideout, a place where information is stored and guarded." I glanced around, unease settling in the pit of my stomach. There was something unsettlingly deliberate about the way everything was arranged. It felt like a maze of secrecy, designed to confuse, misdirect, and hide whatever was truly important. A low, muffled sound came from deeper within the building, cutting through the stillness. I froze, listening intently. "There," Holmes said, his voice barely a whisper. "We're not alone." Without another word, he moved swiftly toward the sound, his steps silent, his body tense with anticipation. I followed closely behind, my hand instinctively moving to the grip of my pistol. As we rounded a corner, I caught sight of a figure up ahead. A man, his back to us, hunched over what appeared to be a large wooden crate. Holmes motioned for me to stay back as he approached. I could see his mind working in overdrive, already calculating the next move. As he got closer, Holmes called out, "Excuse me, sir, can you help us?" The man froze, his body rigid. Slowly, he turned around. He was older than I had expected, with sharp, angular features, and his eyes were a dark, calculating shade. His lips twisted into a grin, but it was the sort of smile that chilled the blood. "Holmes, I presume," the man said, his voice smooth but laced with an undercurrent of menace. Holmes's lips curved into a smile of his own. "Indeed. And you must be the one who has been guarding the secrets of Tobias Granger. Shall we discuss the treasure you've been hiding?" The man's grin widened, and he took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving Holmes's face. "I think, Mr. Holmes, you have underestimated the danger of your curiosity. But it's too late to turn back now, isn't it?" Holmes stood still, his eyes locked onto the man's. "I've never been one to turn back." The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the silent exchange between Holmes and the stranger. I could feel the pulse of the moment quickening. This was no ordinary criminal, no run-of-the-mill rogue. This was someone who knew the stakes, someone whose understanding of the game surpassed the usual scheming of the underworld. He was playing for keeps. Holmes's gaze never wavered from the man before him, but I could see the subtle shifts in his posture, a slight tightening of his jaw, a flicker of awareness in his eyes, as if he were calculating his next move, analyzing every word, every breath in the room. The man's grin widened further, and he stepped closer, his shoes clicking ominously on the wooden floorboards. The air seemed to grow heavier, more suffocating with each step he took. "Mr. Holmes," the man said smoothly, his voice dropping lower, tinged with both amusement and danger, "you're very persistent, but you should know. Some mysteries are better left unsolved." Holmes tilted his head slightly, as though intrigued. "Oh, I assure you, Mr. Granger, I've never found a mystery that wasn't worth solving." He paused, his gaze flicking to the strange objects around us, the mechanical contraptions cluttering the shelves like abandoned curiosities. "But I'm curious, what exactly is it that you're guarding so fervently here?" Granger's eyes flickered to the crate behind him, and then back to Holmes, narrowing slightly. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, do you?" Holmes didn't flinch. "I've stumbled into many things over the years, and they've all led me somewhere worth going." The tension crackled in the air like static. Granger took another step, his hand moving inside his coat. For a brief, fleeting moment, I feared he might draw a weapon, but Holmes was quicker, his hand already reaching inside his own coat for his signature deerstalker hat, as if it were some kind of signal. I knew then that this wasn't a mere exchange of words. It was a duel of minds. The man hesitated, realizing that he couldn't intimidate Holmes into submission. Instead, he straightened his posture, an eerie calm settling over him. "Perhaps it's time for you to see the true scope of things, Mr. Holmes. You've been led to the wrong conclusions." Holmes didn't flinch. "I'm sure I haven't." Granger seemed to weigh his words carefully before continuing, his tone cool. "Very well, then. Since you're determined to find out, let me show you." He turned on his heel and strode toward the back of the room, gesturing for us to follow. Holmes gave me a brief, almost imperceptible glance, his eyes narrowing with a silent warning. He knew this man far better than I did, and that knowledge put us both on edge. There was something deeply unsettling about Granger. He moved with the assured confidence of a man who had orchestrated every step of this operation with meticulous precision. We followed him in silence, the creaking of the floorboards beneath our feet the only sound accompanying our movement. The back of the building was darker, shrouded in shadow. As we reached the farthest corner of the room, Granger came to a stop in front of an iron door, seemingly hidden from view. "There," he said, nodding toward the entrance. "Behind that door lies the heart of everything you've been chasing. The treasure, the secret, the one thing that ties all of this together." Holmes stepped forward, studying the door carefully, his fingers lightly brushing against the iron handle. His brow furrowed, and I saw the familiar gleam in his eyes, the one that said he was already 2 or 3 steps ahead. "I'm sure you think this will be the end of it," Holmes said softly, his voice almost distant. "But there's something you've forgotten, Granger. You underestimated the people you've been toying with." The man's lips curled into a sneer, but it was quickly replaced by a look of resignation. "I underestimated you, Holmes. I won't deny that." He turned the handle and pushed the door open, the hinges protesting with a long, drawn-out creak. The room beyond was small, dimly lit by a single hanging lantern. The walls were lined with shelves, cluttered with mechanical parts and odd trinkets, but it was the center of the room that caught my attention. There, in the middle of the floor, was a large glass display case, its contents hidden beneath a heavy cloth. "Go on, Holmes," Granger said, his voice tinged with mockery. "Have a look." Holmes stepped forward without hesitation, his eyes locked on the case. There was something about the way he moved, the way he approached it with deliberate caution, that made my heart race. He reached down and lifted the cloth with careful precision. Underneath, nestled within the velvet lining, was a large mechanical clock, a clock unlike any I had ever seen before. It was intricate, its gears and cogs visible through the glass, almost as though they were alive, moving with purpose. At the top of the clock, a symbol was engraved, an ancient seal I had only seen in the most obscure of texts. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly with both awe and trepidation. Granger's eyes gleamed with a sickening satisfaction. "This, Dr. Watson, is the key to everything, the Clockmaker's legacy. You see, Mr. Holmes, the treasure you've been hunting isn't gold or jewels. It's a map that, once decoded, will lead us to the true power. And now that you've found it, well, let's just say that I hope you'll enjoy the view from the other side." Holmes turned sharply, his expression hardening. "You've been using the clocks as a means to hide the true nature of your operation, but you underestimated the one thing you didn't account for, my persistence." Granger's smile faded, and he took a step back, suddenly aware of how little control he had left in the situation. He had wanted this moment, this unveiling, to be his triumph. Instead, it had turned into his undoing. "I think," Holmes continued, "that it's time to end this game." Before Granger could react, Holmes was already moving. The scene before me seemed to slow as Holmes's hand shot forward, grabbing the mechanical clock from the display case. His fingers quickly traced the intricate designs etched into the clock's face, his mind working at lightning speed to decipher the hidden messages within the gears. "I knew you wouldn't make this easy, Holmes," Granger snarled, taking a step toward the door. "But you've already lost." Holmes didn't respond immediately. His concentration focused entirely on the clock before him. Then, with a decisive click, he pressed a hidden button on the underside of the device. The walls around us began to shift with an ominous grinding sound. The game had just changed. Chapter 13. The Clockmaker's Legacy Unraveled. The grinding of the walls echoed through the room, like the deep rumbling of an approaching storm. For a brief moment, the sound drowned out all other noise, and I felt as though the very foundation of the building was shifting beneath our feet. Holmes's face, usually the embodiment of calm and composure, betrayed a hint of urgency, his eyes darting back and forth as he studied the mechanism in his hands with feverish intensity. Granger, for the first time in our encounter, looked less certain. His usual swagger faltered, his eyes flashing between the strange mechanical device Holmes held and the shifting walls around us. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. "What did you find, Holmes?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. His fingers moved with expert precision, twisting the clock's face, manipulating its delicate gears and hidden levers. Each movement seemed to bring us closer to a revelation, a truth that had been buried for years. The Clockmaker's legacy, it seemed, was more than just a family heirloom. It was a puzzle in and of itself, a map to something far greater. "This," Holmes finally spoke, his voice laced with quiet triumph, "is no ordinary timepiece. It's a key to a legacy that has been carefully hidden for generations." He paused, his eyes glancing momentarily at Granger. "You see, Granger, this clock is more than a tool for measuring time. It is a message, one encoded in the very design of its gears, its movements. And now, after all this time, the message is finally coming to light." Granger's face darkened. He took a step back, his posture defensive, his hand instinctively going to the inside of his coat, where I could only assume he kept some sort of weapon. "You're a fool, Holmes," he spat. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. That clock doesn't hold some treasure. It's a trap. And you've just activated it." Holmes didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering as he continued to manipulate the clock. He seemed to hear Granger's words, but did not let them distract him. His mind was already far ahead, working through the puzzle with an elegance that only he could manage. It was as though time itself bent to his will. "What you fail to understand, Granger," Holmes said, his voice calm but laced with a note of finality, "is that you've spent so many years in the shadows, trying to manipulate events, to steer others toward your own agenda. But you underestimated me, and more importantly, you underestimated the Clockmaker's true intentions." Granger's sneer deepened, but there was a tremor in his voice now, something that spoke of desperation. "You think this will end in your favor, Holmes? You think you've won? This was never about you or your petty investigations. It's about power, about controlling the world itself." Holmes's fingers finally stilled, and for the briefest moment, the room fell silent. Then, with a soft click, the last gear turned into place, and the entire mechanism shifted. The walls ceased their grinding, the sound now replaced by the soft hum of a hidden compartment opening within the clock's face. The device had revealed something that had been hidden for years, perhaps even centuries. Holmes looked up from the clock with an expression of profound understanding. He reached carefully into the compartment and retrieved a small, intricately carved key, a key that appeared ancient, its surface worn and smooth from years of use. "This is the key, Granger," Holmes said, holding the object up for us all to see. "It was hidden within the clock all along, waiting for the right person to uncover it. This key, I believe, will lead us to the final piece of the puzzle, the treasure that has been so carefully concealed." Granger's eyes widened, his face now an odd mixture of awe and fear. For the first time in our encounter, I saw a crack in his composure, the certainty of his earlier bravado replaced by something far more human, the fear of being outwitted. "No," he said, his voice low and almost pleading. "You don't understand. You can't." But Holmes was already moving, his gaze fixed firmly on the key in his hand. He turned it over slowly, studying its every angle as though searching for some hidden message within its shape. There was no doubt in his mind that this was the key to unlocking whatever Granger had been hiding all these years. "You see, Granger," Holmes continued, his voice steady but unwavering, "this isn't just a game to me. This is about uncovering the truth. no matter how deeply it's buried, no matter how many layers of deception you've stacked upon it. Granger took another step back, his hands still clutching the inside of his coat, but he no longer seemed certain. His eyes flicked to the door, as if weighing his options. I could tell he was considering running. His pride, his arrogance, had been shattered, and now his only instinct was self-preservation. But Holmes had anticipated this, as always. "You're not going anywhere," he said simply, his eyes cold and unwavering. Granger hesitated, his breath coming faster, more erratically. For a moment, he seemed as though he might try to make a run for it anyway, but the sound of footsteps outside the door halted him. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Lestrade," Holmes muttered, his eyes never leaving Granger. "I imagine you've been waiting just outside the door for the right moment." Granger's eyes snapped to the door in panic, but before he could react, the door swung open, and there, framed in the doorway, stood Inspector Lestrade. His expression was stern, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his truncheon. "Well, well," Lestrade said with a sly smile, his eyes flicking between Holmes and Granger. "It seems you've been busy, Mr. Granger, but I'm afraid your little operation has come to an end." Granger looked as though he might protest, but the sight of Lestrade and his men entering the room seemed to deflate him. The air seemed to go out of him, and with it, any remaining courage. It was clear now that the game was over. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Granger said weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. Holmes, however, was not fooled. "You've been involved in smuggling, Granger," he said, his tone firm. "The mechanical clocks, the coded messages, the carefully orchestrated plans. It was all part of a larger scheme. You used the Clockmaker's legacy to conceal your true intentions, but it was only a matter of time before it all unraveled." Granger opened his mouth to argue, but Holmes cut him off with a gesture. "There's no need for you to waste your breath. You're done." Lestrade stepped forward, his face hardening as he moved to apprehend Granger. "You're coming with us, Mr. Granger, and I trust you'll be more forthcoming once we're at the station." As Granger was taken away, Holmes turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "This, Watson," he said, "is only the beginning. There are still many questions to be answered, many more pieces to this puzzle that must be put together. But for now, we can rest assured that Granger will not be causing any more trouble." I nodded, still trying to process the events of the past hours. It was hard to believe how much had transpired in such a short period of time. Granger's operation, hidden in plain sight for so long, had been brought to light, but it was clear that there were deeper layers to this mystery, layers that would require even more work, more patience, and more careful observation. Holmes, as always, was already thinking ahead. "Come, Watson, we have much to discuss, and a few more pieces of the puzzle to uncover." As we left the room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the complexity of the case. But I also knew one thing for certain. With Holmes at the helm, no mystery, no matter how intricately woven, could ever remain unsolved for long. Chapter 14. The Final Revelation. The quiet hum of Baker Street greeted us as we made our way back to the familiar sanctuary of Holmes's study. The tension that had gripped us for the past few days was now beginning to ebb, but a strange unease lingered in the air. It was as though a veil had been pulled back, revealing a much larger, far more dangerous game than either of us had anticipated. The threads were still loose, the full story still untold. Holmes's eyes were fixed ahead as we entered his study, his movements brisk, as though he had already moved past the excitement of our recent victory. I could see the familiar signs of deep thought in his posture. His hands were steepled together, his brow furrowed slightly, and his lips pressed into a thin line of concentration. "Watson, there is much more at play here than Granger," Holmes said as he began to pace in front of the fireplace, his voice low and deliberate. His involvement was but one cog in a much larger machine, a machine that stretches beyond the confines of mere smuggling and into something far more intricate and dangerous. I had learned to pay attention to Holmes's every word when he spoke like this. There were always layers to his deductions, and he often spoke in riddles when piecing together a complex case. But this time, it felt different. There was an edge to his voice, a quiet urgency that was unfamiliar to me. "You're right," I said, looking at him carefully. But what's the bigger picture? What are we missing? Holmes stopped pacing, his gaze now fixed on a small, faded map that hung on the wall above his desk. The map was not of London, but of a distant part of the world, a region I recognized only vaguely, a place steeped in mystery and intrigue. This map, Watson, is of the Far East. Specifically, it traces the ancient trade routes that passed through India, Persia, and China. Granger's operation, his smuggling ring, it's all tied to these routes, to a long-forgotten network of merchant families and shadowy organizations that have dealt in opium for centuries. I leaned forward, my interest piqued. You're suggesting that Granger was just a small player in something much larger? Holmes nodded, his eyes never leaving the map. Indeed, Granger's smuggling network was merely a small arm of a far more powerful organization that operates from the shadows. This organization is far older than anyone realizes. It has infiltrated many aspects of society, including some of the highest echelons of British power. The words struck me with the force of a thunderclap. I had known for some time that the case was more complex than it appeared, but I hadn't anticipated the far-reaching implications of what Holmes was suggesting. You mean, I stammered, that Granger wasn't just working with a handful of criminals? He was involved in a much bigger conspiracy? Holmes turned from the map, his eyes meeting mine with a look of grim determination. Exactly. And we are only scratching the surface. Granger's connections run deep, deeper than even he knew. I took a deep breath, trying to process what Holmes was implying. This was not merely a case of drug smuggling. It was an international network of power, one that reached far beyond anything we could have imagined. And the Clockmaker's legacy, once thought to be nothing more than an eccentric inheritance, was the key to unlocking it all. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he seemed to think through the next steps. We need to find out more about the Clockmaker's past, Watson, about who he associated with, who he might have been hiding from, and who would benefit from his silence. I have a feeling that his death wasn't accidental at all. He was murdered, Watson. Murdered to cover up a trail that stretches far back into the past. But who could have known about this? I asked, trying to make sense of it all. Who else knew about the secrets the Clockmaker kept? That, Holmes said with a slight smile, is what we need to discover. And I have a few ideas. But first, we need to meet with someone. His sudden change of subject piqued my curiosity. Who do we need to see? Holmes's lips curled into a faint grin. Someone who can shed more light on the Clockmaker's legacy. I've arranged for us to visit an old acquaintance of mine, a man by the name of Felix Smythe. He's a historian, a collector of obscure artifacts, and someone who has a particular interest in the opium trade. I raised an eyebrow at this revelation. An expert on the opium trade? And he's connected to this case? Holmes's smile deepened. Indeed. Smythe has a collection of rare books and manuscripts that date back centuries. Among them, I believe, is a document that will tie everything together, the final link we need. As Holmes gathered his things, preparing for our meeting with Smythe, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. What had started as a straightforward case of a clockmaker's death had evolved into a conspiracy that spanned continents and centuries. It was a mystery that reached into the darkest corners of history, and we were about to uncover secrets that had been buried for far too long. We arrived at Felix Smythe's residence later that evening, a grand, imposing townhouse nestled in one of London's quieter districts. Smythe was a man of considerable wealth and taste, his collection of rare artifacts and books being a testament to his eccentricity. The townhouse was lined with shelves of ancient texts and curiosities from around the world, each one more unusual than the last. Despite the elegance of the surroundings, there was an air of mystery about the place, a sense that the walls themselves held secrets waiting to be uncovered. Felix Smythe, an elderly man with graying hair and sharp features, greeted us at the door with a measured calm. His piercing blue eyes seemed to assess us with the same intensity that Holmes brought to every investigation. Despite his years, there was a certain vitality about him, a sharpness of mind that belied his age. "Holmes, Watson," he said, offering a warm but reserved handshake. "I assume this visit is about more than just a casual chat?" Holmes wasted no time in getting to the point. Indeed, Smythe, we need your expertise. We're investigating a case that involves a clockmaker, an ancient family legacy, and a vast smuggling operation. We believe you have access to a particular document, one that can help us make sense of it all. Smythe's eyebrows raised slightly, and he motioned for us to sit. I see. Well, you're correct in assuming I possess something that might help you. I have a manuscript, one that details the early days of the opium trade in the East. It's a rare document written by someone who was closely involved in the trade. The clockmaker's family name appears in the text, though it's mentioned only in passing. Holmes leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Smythe. We believe that the clockmaker was not just a craftsman, but a key figure in the opium trade. His work, his family connections, they're all part of a larger scheme, one that has remained hidden for far too long. Can we see the manuscript? Smythe nodded slowly. I'll fetch it for you, but be warned, it's not a document to be taken lightly. It holds knowledge that some would prefer remain buried. With that, Smythe disappeared into another room, leaving Holmes and me to ponder the significance of his words. My mind raced with possibilities. If this manuscript held the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy, it could change everything. The clockmaker's legacy, far from being a relic of the past, was part of a much larger story, one that spanned the globe and involved some of the most powerful people in the world. Holmes seemed lost in thought, his gaze distant, but I could tell that his mind was already working through the problem, piecing together the fragments of the mystery. His calm demeanor betrayed nothing of the whirlwind of thought that churned beneath the surface. He was, as always, steps ahead of me, ready to make the next move. As Smythe returned with the manuscript in hand, I felt the weight of the moment settle over us. The final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place, and with it, the truth behind the clockmaker's legacy. Chapter 15. The Clockmaker's Secret. The manuscript that Felix Smythe retrieved from his private study was old, its edges browned with age, and the cover, once leather-bound, had faded to a dull, cracked surface. As he placed it on the table between us, I could feel the weight of its significance. This thin volume contained the answers to questions that had plagued us for weeks. Holmes, who had been inspecting the room with a quiet intensity, moved forward to open the manuscript. I, ever the dutiful companion, stood at his side, my mind racing to piece together the complex web that had been spun around the death of the clockmaker, the opium trade, and the dark forces at play in the shadows of London. This was no longer just a case. It was the revelation of something much deeper, a conspiracy that extended far beyond the walls of a clockmaker's shop or the damp streets of the East End. Felix Smythe's eyes, though intelligent, were clouded with a certain unease. I could tell that he, too, knew the importance of the document, but was perhaps not fully prepared to confront the truth it would reveal. He watched us with the air of a man who had spent a lifetime curating knowledge. Only now, that knowledge was about to be used in ways he had not foreseen. Holmes opened the book, his fingers brushing against the fragile pages, and as he began reading aloud, I could hear the quiet weight of history in his voice. His eyes flicked across the text, scanning the words with surgical precision. I knew by the deepening lines in his face that he was absorbing everything at once, as he often did, the pieces clicking together with uncanny accuracy. The Clockmaker's Legacy, A Family History in Time and Trade, Holmes muttered as he read the title, his voice low. Interesting. This is no mere family record, Watson. It speaks of something much older. Smythe's voice trembled as he leaned in, his gaze fixed on the book. That manuscript, Holmes, I've never allowed anyone to see it before. It's been in my collection for years, and I have only begun to understand its true significance. I always believed it to be a curious artifact, but I never suspected it to hold the answers to a riddle that had remained unsolved for so long. Holmes looked up from the book, his expression sharp. What do you know of the clockmaker's family, Smythe? And what was their involvement in the opium trade? Felix's eyes darted nervously around the room, as though he were weighing whether or not to divulge more than he had already. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his thinning hair, and sat back in his chair, his voice low. Over 25 years ago, the clockmaker, Edward Ravenscroft, came to me with a request. He wanted me to look into the history of his family, to understand their connections to an ancient, wealthy dynasty of merchants who had once trafficked in opium. Ravenscroft was convinced that his family had been involved in something much darker than he had been told, but he wanted to keep it hidden. He had been slowly unraveling a mystery, a legacy of trade and power that stretched all the way back to the Opium Wars in China, the British Empire's involvement, and the financial networks that had grown out of them. My heart skipped a beat as I processed what Smythe was saying. The Ravenscroft family, Edward Ravenscroft, the clockmaker, had been involved in something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. And now I understood that his legacy was not only tied to intricate mechanisms of time, but to an ancient and hidden trade that spanned continents. Holmes's sharp eyes never left Smythe. "You are saying that the Ravenscrofts were more than just clockmakers?" Smythe nodded, his expression grim. "Yes. They were a front for a much larger operation. The Ravenscrofts were a family of aristocrats who had, for generations, been involved in a network of merchants. This network wasn't just focused on luxury goods. It was part of a vast global network that smuggled opium from China to Europe and later to other parts of the British Empire. Edward Ravenscroft was the last living member of that family, but he was determined to cut ties with that history." Holmes's brow furrowed as he turned the page of the manuscript. But someone was trying to force him back into the fold. Someone wanted him to continue the family's legacy, even if it meant his death. "That's correct," Smythe said, his voice shaking. Edward found himself caught in a dangerous game. He was being blackmailed by a man named Bartholomew Lyle, a former associate of his family. Lyle had disappeared 10 years ago, leaving behind only a trail of destruction. Ravenscroft had feared that if his past was ever discovered, it would not only destroy him, but also expose a network of power and wealth that had long remained hidden. Holmes looked at Smythe with renewed intensity. "And you believe Lyle was the one who murdered Ravenscroft?" Smythe hesitated, then nodded. "Lyle wasn't working alone, though. There were others involved, powerful people who had a vested interest in maintaining the secrecy of the opium trade. So Edward Ravenscroft had become a liability. He had learned too much, and when he began to uncover the true extent of the family's involvement in the operation, it was clear that someone would have to silence him." Holmes closed the manuscript with a finality that seemed to echo through the room. So it was no accident. Ravenscroft's death was orchestrated, but it was more than just a simple murder. It was part of a larger conspiracy. I sat back in my chair, half-stressed, trying to process everything. I had never imagined that a case so seemingly simple would lead to such an intricate and far-reaching conspiracy. What had begun as the death of a clockmaker had now spiraled into a story of international smuggling, blackmail, and betrayal, all hidden under the guise of a family legacy. Holmes's gaze softened for a moment before he spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to take this to the authorities, Watson. The conspiracy is vast, but it is not invincible. We have uncovered the truth, and now we must ensure that those responsible for Ravenscroft's death and the thousands who have suffered as a result of this trade are held accountable." Felix Smythe stood slowly, his face pale as the weight of the situation settled over him. "You're right, Holmes. I've lived with this knowledge for far too long, but I never had the courage to confront it. I always believed that the truth would destroy me. But now, I see that keeping this secret is worse than revealing it." Holmes nodded in agreement. It is time for the truth to come to light. With that, we left Smythe's townhouse and made our way to Scotland Yard. The final stage of our investigation had begun. The conspiracy was unraveling. The dark forces that had once seemed impenetrable were now within reach, and justice, though delayed, was about to be served. The investigation that followed was swift and decisive. Thanks to the evidence provided by Felix Smythe's manuscript and the careful deductions Holmes had made, the authorities were able to track down Bartholomew Lyle and his associates, who had been hiding under the guise of legitimate business. The scope of the opium trade, which had once seemed impossible to disrupt, was revealed to be far more vulnerable than anyone had imagined. Within weeks, Lyle and several of his accomplices were arrested, and the vast network they had built over decades was dismantled. The Ravenscroft family's dark legacy was laid bare for the world to see, and Edward Ravenscroft's name was cleared of any involvement in the illegal operations. But even as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Holmes remained restless, as he always did after a case like this. I could see the distant look in his eyes, the subtle twitch of his fingers as he turned the pages of a newspaper, scanning the headlines for new puzzles to solve. "It is finished, Watson," Holmes said one evening, his voice quiet as we sat in his study, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. "But the world never stops turning. Another case is always waiting." I nodded, knowing that, like all of Holmes's cases, this one would eventually fade into the annals of history. But for me, and for those whose lives had been touched by this case, the legacy of the clockmaker would never be forgotten. And so the tale of the clockmaker's secret came to an end, only to be replaced by another mystery, another puzzle to be solved. For Sherlock Holmes, there would always be another shadow to chase, another truth to uncover. Epilogue: The Passing of Time. The days following the resolution of the clockmaker's legacy were marked by an uneasy calm that settled over London. The investigation had wrapped up with surprising efficiency, as Holmes so often managed to achieve, leaving behind a trail of grateful officials and law enforcement officers. Yet, as I observed him during those final days, I noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor, a fleeting sadness that passed over him like a shadow on a cloudy day. We were sitting in his study one late afternoon, the sun setting behind the thick curtains that lined the window, casting long, soft shadows across the room. Holmes was leafing through a journal, though I could tell his mind was elsewhere. His eyes were distant, as if lost in some thought or consideration that I could not penetrate. "Holmes," I said, breaking the silence, "I have been thinking about the case and all that we uncovered. It's strange to think that the Ravenscroft legacy, which seemed so ancient and elusive, has been brought to light. For some families, such knowledge might bring relief. But I wonder." I trailed off, unsure of what to say next. Holmes closed the journal slowly, his gaze lifting to meet mine. "You are right, Watson," he replied quietly, his voice devoid of the usual sharpness that characterized his deductions. "The truth has a way of being both liberating and burdensome. In this case, Felix Smythe has now freed himself from the ghosts of the past. But for others, the burden of truth is far heavier. Ravenscroft, for all his efforts to sever the ties with his family's dark history, could not escape the consequences of their actions." I nodded thoughtfully, understanding the depths of Holmes's reflection. And yet, some truths are buried deep, never to see the light of day. There are still mysteries, no doubt, lurking in the corners of this city, waiting to be uncovered. Holmes gave a brief, fleeting smile, one that held no humor. "Indeed, Watson, the world is full of secrets. Some are hidden in plain sight, while others are buried beneath layers of history, like the clockmaker's legacy. But the pursuit of those secrets is a never-ending task. There is always something new to unravel, some corner of the world that needs shedding light upon." His words carried the weight of years of experience, the countless cases that had crossed his path, and the many more that would continue to do so, long after this one had faded into the past. I could see the restless energy beneath his calm exterior, the undying thirst for the next puzzle, the next mystery that would pull him from the quiet comforts of 221B Baker Street and into the depths of danger and intrigue. "I trust you'll take some rest, Holmes," I said, hoping to ease the tension I felt in the room. "You've earned it after all the work on this case." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. "Rest is a luxury, Watson, one that I do not often afford myself. But I appreciate your concern. Perhaps a small respite is in order. After all, there are only so many hours in a day, and the clock is always ticking." I chuckled, though I knew he was not entirely joking. He was, after all, a man whose life was defined by the clock. Each case, each challenge was a race against time, and as long as there was a puzzle to solve, he would chase it without pause. The evening wore on, and we shared a quiet dinner, the weight of our recent case lingering between us like a memory that refused to fade. The case of the clockmaker's legacy had left its mark on both of us, but for Holmes, I knew it was already receding into the background, replaced by something else, something yet to be discovered. As I retired to my room that night, I found myself reflecting on the strange and often unsettling nature of our work. We had uncovered a truth buried in the gears of time, a legacy that had spanned generations. But there were many more mysteries out there, hidden in the shadows of history, waiting for the right mind to uncover them. I smiled to myself as I thought of Holmes. The mysteries would never stop coming, and neither would he. His work was not just a profession, it was his purpose. A clock that never stopped ticking, a mind that never ceased to puzzle over the unknown. The world had not yet seen the last of Sherlock Holmes, and I, for one, was content to follow him through whatever came next. Several months passed, and the world continued to spin, indifferent to the passing of time. Holmes and I had settled back into our regular routine, though there was an unspoken understanding that the case we had solved was one of significance. It had marked the end of an era for the Ravenscroft family, and the beginning of something new for Felix Smythe, who had found peace, at least for now, from the haunting legacy of his family's involvement in the opium trade. One evening, as I sat by the fire reading a medical journal, there was a knock at the door. I rose to answer it, surprised to see Lestrade standing in the doorway, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Holmes, Watson," Lestrade began, stepping inside. "I trust you've heard the latest news." Holmes looked up from his chair, his interest piqued. "No, Lestrade, what is it?" "The Ravenscroft case," Lestrade said, lowering his voice. "It's not over. We've just received word of something." Unsettling. There's been a rise in the smuggling of opium once again, but this time, the network has expanded, and it's far more dangerous than we originally thought. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and I could see the flicker of excitement in his gaze. "I see," he murmured. "So, the shadow of the past still lingers, does it?" Lestrade nodded. "Indeed. And it seems that someone is trying to re-establish the old routes, using the very legacy that Ravenscroft sought to escape." Holmes stood, his gaze intense. "The clock never stops, Watson, and neither do the mysteries. It appears that our work is far from finished." As I watched him turn toward the door, I knew in that moment that we were once again on the precipice of something much larger. The case of the Clockmaker's legacy had been a victory, but in the world of Sherlock Holmes, one mystery always led to the next. And so, as the clock continued to tick, so did the relentless pursuit of the unknown. The game, as always, was afoot. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to leave a comment letting us know which story you'd like to hear next and where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our detective fans around the world. See you in the next adventure.